When the last detachments of the Roman army sailed away, they didn't just leave empty barracks behind. They removed the tax spine and legal musculature that had kept Britain stitched into an imperial body for 3 centuries. The fiscal machine that paid for roads, walls, river patrols and garrisons faltered first, then failed. Coins thinned out of circulation in the 400s. Towns shrank into defensible cores or bled out into black earth, and villa estates that had been agrarian factories became roofless courtyards and scavenger pits. The rescript to the Britons, "See to your own defence," was less an order than an unmasking. You're on your own. Power abhors a vacuum, and so do men with swords. Civic councils that used to hire repair crews began hiring warbands. Hill forts from an older era were refaced for a new one. Along the eastern and southern coasts, the line of Roman Saxon shore forts, big masonry statements at places like Richborough and Pevensey, contained more ghosts than soldiers. Sea raiders knew it. So did the Picts pushing down from the north and Irish Scotti pressing from the west. Brittonic elites, still literate, still Catholic, tried to play late imperial games without an empire, recruit federate allies, settle them on marginal land, pay them to fight your enemies. On paper, that's policy. In practice, it's a loaded invitation to men who understand that the hand that holds the spear soon holds the farm it defends. The names are half historical, half memory, and that's fine. The mechanism matters more than the faces. A leader remembered as Vortigern invites Germanic warlords, Angles, Saxons, Jutes to serve as foederati. They arrive with ships, shields, and families. Everything that follows is textbook political physics. Once inside the defensive ring, the federates can renegotiate from strength. Disputes over rations and land escalate into burning towns and emptied countryside. Gildas, the angry monk who writes after the worst of it, calls it a fire that spread from sea to sea. That's rhetoric. The real point is that, over decades, coastal beachheads became corridors, and corridors became kingdoms in everything but name. Archaeology fills the silence Roman scribes used to occupy. Cemeteries along the Thames, in East Anglia, and on the south coast shift to weapon burials, spears, shields, the occasional pattern-welded sword prized far beyond its battlefield use. Cremations in urn fields appear where inhumations had been standard, and sunken featured buildings, Grobenhäuser dot new farmsteads. Place names sprout like flags. Ham Ton, Ingus, broadcasting who holds the land. Trade doesn't vanish, it reroutes. Continental pottery and beads arrive not via imperial customs houses, but through informal harbours and river mouths controlled by whoever can muster 20 men and a boat. Brittonic polities do not evaporate. They recenter into terrain that rewards knowing the ground. The Western Peninsula, Dumnonia, the Welsh uplands, Gwynedd, Powys, the northern kingdoms of the old wall zone, Reged, Strathclyde. Their elites speak Latin in church, Brittonic in the hall, and they mint legitimacy out of survival. A commander remembered as Ambrosius Aurelianus rallies resistance. A battle remembered as Mount Badon checks expansion around the turn of the 6th century. Whether or not Arthur is a single man or an anthology of successful war leaders is almost beside the point. The effect is observable. For a generation, the frontier hardens. That pause lets both sides consolidate. British kingship hardens around hilltop courts and saintly foundations. Anglo-Saxon leadership matures from raid chiefs into landlords. The economy doesn't revert to barbarism. It simplifies without the tax and supply circuit. From London to the Wall, surplus has to travel as gifts and booty, not requisitions and salaries. That changes who gets rich. A man who can gather a comitatus, gesists in Old English, around a hall full of meat, mead, and plunder, becomes a node. Law is personal. Oaths, sureties, vendettas, and justice is what the most dangerous consensus says it is. Christian bishops still write letters, monasteries keep books and relic lists. But in many zones, the altar loses the magistrate's bench as a near neighbour. Weaponry mirrors the politics. The spear is king because it's cheap, lethal and flexible. Shields, round, bossed, made to punch as much as to parry, create the nucleus of the shield wall that later chroniclers will fetishize. Helmets are rare prestige items. Mail is rarer still. The Sikhs, the long knife that will become a cultural emblem, says the quiet part out loud. Every man is armed because every encounter is a negotiation that might need steel to finalize. Horses matter, but as transport and status more than as shock. Fighting is mostly on foot, in hedged fields and river crossings, at palisades and ford guards. Logistics is the constraining god. The side that eats this week fights next week. Towns mutate. London within the Roman walls slumps. London Wick rises just upriver as an open emporium in the next period. Verulamium bleeds population while St. Albans, the saint's cult, not the forum's rent, anchors regional identity. The urban grid doesn't vanish, it repurposes. Masonry gets quarried to face timber halls. Amphitheatres become quarries. Basilicas become barns or churches, depending on who holds them. Roads survive where armies or cattle need them. Elsewhere, travel detours to ridgelines and riverways because that's where security, your own watchpoints, can function. The church survives by being useful. In British zones, it provides literacy, legal memory, and sanctuary networks, and it packages kingship with saintly legitimacy. Your line is defended not only by spears, but by the relics of a local martyr and the pen of a hagiographer. In Germanic zones, priests and monks are initially thin on the ground, but even pagan kings appreciate scribes who can tally tribute and handle foreign envoys. Missionary outposts probe east from Wales and north from Gaul, but before 59-7 they are needles in hayfields. The real ecclesiastical surge will come when a king with a Frankish queen wants his god to be as international as his trade. Politics stratifies. By the mid-6th century, you can name English-speaking power centres even if their borders are missed. The Jutish Kingdom in Kent, with its channel-facing ties, the South Saxons in Sussex, holding coastal strips, East Saxons around the Thames, estuary, East Angles in the flat, river-rich East-West Saxons pushing up the chalk, Anglian strongholds further north consolidating as Bernicia and Deira. None of these yet controls the others, and none can afford to ignore the Brittonic kingdoms to their west. This is not a clean replacement, it's a mosaic rearranged by pressure and opportunity. What drives the rearrangement is not ideology, but incentives. Kings call them that, now without modern pomp. Grant land to bind men who have swords and boats. Those grants aren't yet written charters. They're witnessed gifts, sealed with rings and feasts, remembered by men who owe a season's fighting for a season's harvest. In British polities, clientage networks look similar. A lord secures cattle rights and hill pastures for his men. In return, they answer an alarm bell faster than a message can ride to any notional centre. Where Roman-style civitas boundaries still matter, they do so because a bishop or a surviving tax district can mobilise labour to raise a dike or repair a road. Where they don't, new lines get drawn by the swing of a warband and the reach of a river. If you want a hard metric for change, follow burial practice and metal flow. Grave goods abound in the early 500s. Then start thinning near the late 500s. As Christian norms seep eastward, and elite display shifts from the grave to the church doorway, continental trade resurges in glass and fine metalwork, but now it runs through elite-controlled beach markets, not imperial depots. Diplomatic gifts, brooches, swords, exotic coins, are not curiosities. They are the grease that keeps alliances from grinding themselves into vendetta. The British didn't lose because they were somehow less brave. They lost ground where lines of communication and reinforcement failed. Flat east and south coasts, open to short-hop migration, river systems that let small fleets leapfrog fort to farm. They held where terrain bribed time mountains, moors and promontories where a few hundred men could make an army feel like a rumour. And even lost is the wrong verb. Many British lineages simply rebranded under kings, whose speech and gods changed with the political weather. Identities on frontiers are negotiated, not downloaded. By 59-7, the year a Roman monk walks ashore at Thanet, two truths shape the island. First, kingship is the only technology that scales men who can mobilize fighting seasons, levy food and arbitrate blood feuds across river basins, control outcomes. Second, these kings want something the spear cannot mint, legitimacy that outlasts them, that need administration, literacy, a law that's more than a chieftain's threat, will give Augustine his opening. The warrior age isn't ending, it's about to get organized. The man in the brown habit who steps onto Kentish sand in 5997 is not bringing religion to a pagan wilderness. He's bringing a package, literacy, international connections, a legal memory that can bind oaths, and a bureaucracy that fits inside a monastery but scales to a kingdom. Augustine of Canterbury arrives with letters from Pope Gregory and timing from Queen Bertha, Frankish, Christian, and married to Kent's king, Ethelbert. That marriage is a geopolitical tell. Kent's eyes are on the Channel, not on the Pennines. A Christianity aligned with Frankish trade and royal kin networks is a business proposition as much as a creed. Conversion at the top is conversion that sticks. Ethelbert accepts baptism and immediately behaves like a modernizer. He issues a law code, not a sermon. It's written in Old English. The first that we know of. Fines were gild, calibrated to status and injury. The king's peace priced higher than an ordinary brawl. What matters here is not the ethics, but the admin. To set fines is to set jurisdiction. To write them is to declare that disputes can be routed through a court instead of a feud. Monasteries and minsters snap to this framework as both spiritual hubs and fiscal nodes. Gifts to the church become bookland land, immunized by charter from certain levies, overseen by men who can keep records, not just memories. Royal power strengthens because it now has partners who can audit a soul and a boundary. Christianity spreads king to king, hall to hall, quorum to quorum. Northumbria takes its turn under Oswald and Oswy, kings who paid for their thrones with exile and bought back their realms with piety and steel. They leverage Iona's Irish mission and then, crucially, bend that charismatic peripatetic style of bishopric into a more predictable Roman calendar. Whitby 66-4, where Oswy adjudicates tonsure and Easter calculations, matters less for haircuts than for habit. Does your church coordinate with Gaul and Rome or run on island time? Oswy chooses Rome. The payoff is a unified ecclesiastical calendar, an archbishop at Canterbury with recognized primacy, and bishops who stop being freelance saints and start being regional managers. Administration grows teeth under Theodore of Tarsus, archbishop from 68. He arrives old, learned, and uninvested in local squabbles. He walks the island, carves dioceses that fit geography instead of genealogy, and convenes synods, the Council of Hertford and others that turn pastoral advice into rules. Penitentials, those grim catalogues of sin with matching tariffs, are more than moral price lists. They teach a kingdom to standardize. If a sin is the same at York and Winchester, a lawsuit can be too. The net effect is a lattice of minsters. The very place name Minster marks them, and bishops' sees that overlay kingdoms with predictable coverage. A king can now send a writ to a bishop he didn't appoint, and expect it to arrive, be read, and cause obedience. That is state capacity disguised as piety. Literacy is not candlelit romance. It is throughput. Think of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow as a research and development campus with a scriptorium instead of a lab. Benedict Biscop hauls wagon loads of books and glaziers across the channel. Within a generation, Northumbria is producing Bed, the man who turns raw annals into narrative and dates into history. Bede's chronicle does politics a favour. It invents an English past where the island's many thrones can see themselves as parts of a single story anchored by Rome. That's ideological infrastructure. While scribes copy gospels in brilliant insular hand, they also copy royal charters, boundary clauses, and leases. Every manuscript is a storage device. Every archive in a monastery is an administrative memory palace kings can raid. Meanwhile, trade plugs back in. The 7th and 8th centuries sprout wicks emporia anchored on tidal rivers with easy continental lanes. London Wick rises outside the old Roman walls, a beach market that turns into a town. Hamwick on the Itchen, Gypswick in East Anglia, Airforwick, York on the Ouse. All run networks of glass, quernstones, pottery, textiles and people. Kings skim tolls, grant protection, and increasingly mint coin to grease the flow. Ceuta's first small dumpy silver pieces, whose types are a numismatist's nightmare and a customs officer's dream. Then by Offers Day, a heavier, standardized silver penny with a royal head that says what needs saying. This is a king who controls weights, measures, and faith. Offer's imitation of an Abbasid dinar in gold is not exotic whimsy. It's proof that ideas and bullion circulate farther and faster than our island stories admit. Mercia and Northumbria take turns as the hegemon, because they invest in both the hard and the soft kit. Northumbria fields kings who can win at Heavenfield and then staff Lindisfarne. Mercia produces Penda, still pagan but perfectly capable of using Christian neighbours' rules against them, and later Ethelbald and Offa, who knit the Midlands to the Thames with roads, wicks and law. Offa's Dyke, the great earthwork running along the border with the Welsh, is less a wall than a statement. Customs barrier, military frontier, labour levy showcase. The act of commanding tens of thousands to move earth by the mile is the act of proving you can. It says to the Welsh, here is the line, and to Mercian sub-kings, here is your king. Law proliferates because rulers see what Kent got right. West Saxon law codes articulate the king's peace, grade wergilds, and specify procedures for oath-taking and ordeal. None of that is a softening of warrior culture. It's a way to monetize it. When homicide has a price, you can budget for peace. When sanctuary exists, you can manage vendetta. When the 100 Court becomes the place where disputes are hashed out, and the Shire is the unit where food renders for royal households are calculated, the king doesn't have to be everywhere. His reeves and his written orders can be. The feared obligation to serve in arms gets formalized as a duty attached to land and status. Kings stop begging for armies and start scheduling them. Monasteries are not just prayer factories, they are agribusinesses, schools, and PR studios. They drain marshes, clear forests, and set up fish weirs, turning donations into rising yields that can feed a royal progress or pay for a bridge. They educate the sons of nobles who will become bishops or ealdormen. They copy saints' lives that make queens and kings, Oswald's arm, Edmund's martyrdom, into rallying flags for counties. They also launder land. A noble who fears that his holdings will be sliced by heirs can gift a chunk to a monastery, reserve usufruct in a charter, and lock his estate into God's hands, where kings hesitate to confiscate. The church isn't parasitic, it's symbiotic. Kings use it to consolidate. The church uses kings to endow. The Irish style of monasticism leaves a permanent imprint, peripatetic scholars, penitential rigour, a love of exile for God. The Roman style supplies hierarchy, canon law, and predictable contacts with Frankish and papal courts. The English synthesis, portable holiness plus stationary administration, yields a church suited to a warrior island, bishops who can negotiate ransoms and immunities, abbots who can provision armies and then write the letters to justify it, scribes who can make a king's gift survive his son's ingratitude. When controversy arises, over Easter, over discipline, the habit of synod settles it. Dispute resolution becomes a habit, not a gamble. Culture follows the money and the monks. Insular art is not decorative driftwood, it's a diplomatic asset. A gospel book fit for an altar is fit for a treaty. When a king sends one to a foreign court, he's advertising that his realm has artists and a surplus to feed them. When missionaries moved through Frisia and the Rhineland, they carry English-backed authority and English-minted gifts. What starts as Kent borrowing status from Francia becomes Mercia and Northumbria exporting it. In return, the island imports scholars and craftsmen and new ideas about how to count, how to calculate Easter, how to build in stone again after a long timber age. By the late 700s, the machinery hums. Shires and hundreds coordinate food renders. Bishops meet on schedule. Kings issue law in their own voice and mint silver with their own face. The royal hall still matters. Oaths still require bodies in a ring and gifts handed over in front of witnesses. But there is now a documentary second skin over the body politic. That second skin makes a realm richer and a king more dangerous. It also makes the realm visible to eyes beyond the North Sea. And that's the sting in the tale. A kingdom that can concentrate wealth at a port and promise that a market will exist on a certain day is a kingdom that invites both merchants and predators. Rich minsters with bells and silver shrines are not just holy, they are targets. The very success of mission and monastery, coin law, literacy, stone churches at exposed river mouths, broadcast opportunity to ship crews who neither respect synods nor fear saints' bones. The first blow falls in 793 at Lindisfarne, and chroniclers will call it a sign of the end times. It isn't. It's the beginning of an arms race that will force the English state to harden in ways its kings have prepared for on paper, but not yet field tested. Before that storm fully breaks, take the ledger. In 2 centuries, an island of warlords became a patchwork of states with calendars, courts, and coins. Kings learned to weaponize law and sanctity. Monasteries learned to count, store, and teach. The church learned to serve both God and government without imagining the two were the same. When the longships cut their prows through the tide and the monks see dragon heads against the dawn, England has more than prayers. It has institutions that can survive the shock and leaders who can turn reaction into revolution. The monks at Lindisfarne heard the weather before they saw the ships, wind, shouldered by oars, surf talking in an unfamiliar rhythm. Then the dragon prows rose out of the grey and the liturgy stopped. 793 is when the Anglo-Saxon chronicle chooses to start the story fierce, foreboding omens. But the raid is not a comet, it's a reconnaissance. The men who step ashore know exactly what they're taking and why it's there. Portable wealth concentrated in a low-walled, river-mouthed, religious site that rings bells on a schedule. That's a logistics calendar, not a warning system. Raids multiply because the incentives are stable and the targets are public. Minsters advertise their silver in processions. Emporia, the Wicks, London Wick, Hamwick, Geiswick, advertise their imports in weekly markets. Kings advertise their progress in predictable circuits. Longships make the island porous. They go where cattle fords cross the river, where a tide turns a creek into a road, where a weir guarantees there is grain to steal upstream. This is not Nordic fury in a vacuum. It's mobile exploitation, riding the very systems trade, coin, regular food renders that England's church and kings have built to get richer. Early responses are local and improvised. A reeve musters a third from 3 or 4 hundreds. The abbess moves the relic chest inland. A bishop writes to a king whose hall is 3 tides away. That works for a generation so long as the raiders are seasonal and the targets are coastal. It fails the moment the Vikings discover overwintering. Hauling ships ashore, ditching a camp, building a palisade, and breaking the calendar breaks the island's reaction time. What had been a swing and run becomes a garrison and reign. From the 850s, the chronicle's rhythm changes. Fleets arrive not to plunder and leave, but to sit at Thanet, Sheppey, the Thames, verb of occupation, not visit. By 865, the Great Army is more than a number. It's an operating model. It is a composite force with multiple leadership nodes, skilled at strategic mobility on land and river, mounted when it wants to be, not as knights, but as infantry that moves like cavalry, and ruthless about logistics. It doesn't need to besiege every town, it needs to smash one, take hostages, and turn former enemies into provisioners. Its charisma runs on success. Each victory drags new men under the banner. East Anglia buys time with horses. Northumbria bleeds kings at York. Mercia, big, rich Mercia, discovers that past hegemony is not armour. The fall of Northumbria is not a simple sacking. It's a political rewire. When the army takes York in 866-867, it exploits old rivalries. Bernicia versus Deira kills the wrong kings at the right time, and installs a regime that knows how to pay. The martyrdom of Edmund in East Anglia, 869, spears and arrows binding a saint into a local cult, does more than birth a shrine. It teaches everyone else that saints will not fight for tribute. Mercia crumples in 874, 875, not because it lacks warriors, but because its assembly of lords cannot synchronize a defense against a foe who rides around its quarrels. The Vikings don't need to annex everything. They can install Ceolwulf as a pliable king, so long as the grain arrives and the roads stay open. Puppet or partner. The chronicle sneers, the receipts decide. Tactics matter, and the Vikings choose them. Shield walls are still the grammar of a pitched battle, but the Vikings choose battles as punctuation, not prose. They favour marches that surprise, feints that split armies, night moves that cross rivers for which the local fard packed no ford. They're not magicians, they're managers. Their winter camp at Repton straddles the Trent and a Roman road. Their spring dispersal uses spokes already laid by a Roman state. Their enemies still live inside without quite remembering how it worked. Where the English have fortified, the Vikings probe. Where the English have not, the Vikings sit and make it true that they have. Coinage lubricates this machine in perverse ways. Those lovely reformed pennies, offers legacy, Alfred's problem, are perfect for buying peace, and buying peace is perfect for incentivizing the next visit. Tribute is not weakness per se. It's a time buy, but time buys results only when a state can convert it into capacity. Northumbria's coiners still stamp exquisite beasts into silver while their kings die. Mercia's tolls ring in the wicks, but its lines of command don't ring at the same pitch. The great army reads this like accountants, not poets. And yet the island is not a corpse. English kings learn while they lose. Shires, hundreds and reeves exist. They can be pushed from mustering militia to coordinating supply and scouts. Bands of household warriors who have spent a decade fighting border wars in Wales and Cornwall learn that the men from across the sea bleed when flanked and run when starved. There are English victories in this decade. At Inglefield at Ashdown, 8715, where a young Alfred creates space with a ferocious downhill charge before his brother can finish praying. At Archenfield, but none is strategically decisive, because none is yet embedded in a system that multiplies it. Then there is Alfred. When his brother Athelred dies in 8071, the crown lands on a man who has read and ridden, prayed and bled, and who knows that the island's problem is not just Danes, but time. 8071 is a year of battles. Ridding defeat, Ashdown victory, Basing defeat, Meriton bloody draw that smells like defeat. Those bruises teach the lesson Alfred will act on later. A king cannot field all the island's men at once, without starving them, and cannot starve the enemy so long as the enemy can choose when to show up. The treaties, those oaths the chronicles mention, are not cowardice. They are breathers to rewire the way the realm breathes. The great army splits, recombines, and maps England by opportunity. Halfdan peels off to Northumbria, parcels land to his men, and works out what it means to turn a raiding band into a settler militia, ploughs as anchors, ships as ferries, a duck's tent slowly fossilizing into a hall. Guthrum, with other leaders, drives south and east, ranges through Mercia, and stares at Wessex as the nut that, if cracked, makes the island his. In winter 877-878, he chooses the kind of timing that wins the war, if it doesn't cost the soul. Twelfth night, when halls are drunk and churches are bright, he lunges at Chippenham and almost pulls the story's plug. Alfred runs. Let the hagiographers turn it into cakes and rebukes. The strategy is pure clarity. You do not die with your household in a hall. You vanish into terrain that favours a man who can rally the countryside without feeding an army from its frostbitten fields. The Somerset levels, water meadows and fens stitched by causeways known to ferrymen and a handful of shepherds, are not a romantic swamp. They're a deny area you can see from a stockaded island, Athelney, while your scouts count enemy foraging parties and your messengers map loyalties. From there, trickles of men, small groups, family bands, household knights who slip the net, begin to arrive. The winter becomes a ledger, who still answers the king's summons when answer means burning your own grange to deny the enemy grain. Across the channel between camps, Guthrum discovers the dark side of winter success. Surprise captures halls. It does not plough fields. Men who sit must eat. The country they sit in has been stripped by last year's marches. A band mounted on stolen horses moves fast, but has to radiate farther every week to find forage. The more it radiates, the thinner its core. No miracle is needed. Just leadership that knows when the enemy has overreached, and the calendar is about to flip from hard frost to lean spring. Alfred's letters go out through the levels like new growth. Easter 87-8 is coming. So is the rendezvous at a place whose name the chronicle makes sound inevitable. Egbert's Stone. The English response is not yet a revolution, it is a concentration. Men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, the western bones of Wessex, answer. They're not fresh, they're furious. They have watched halls go up in smoke and abbey bells fall out of towers. Alfred speaks not of vengeance that can come on its own, but of a campaign, marches, blocking positions, a battle chosen by the side that can afford one. What happens next will become the hinge of a reign, but understand the precondition. The island already possesses enough administration to assemble a field army that isn't a mob. There are hundreds, reeves hides assessed for service, a ritual for forming a shield wall, officers who can hold a flank when the line's middle flexes. The Vikings are not about to be out-barbarianed, they're about to be out-organized. This is where we pause the chapter, because this is where the problem becomes a plan. The Viking shock taught England what bleeds, what breaks, and what bends. It taught kings that tribute buys only the time you can convert into capacity. It taught reeves that watchmen and weirs matter as much as oaths and banners. It taught households that a fort on a ford can rescue a shire, and a shire can sustain a king. In the spring of 87-8, Alfred walks out of the marsh, not as a fugitive, but as a man who has learned what a state would have to look like to survive the next decade. At Edington he will prove a point. In the years after he will make that point permanent. There is a story about a banner, a prayer, and a vow. It doesn't matter whether Alfred composed a speech in the reeds or only breathed one. What matters is that when the West Saxon host formed ranks at Edington in the spring of 80-78, the king understood two things. The enemy would not dissolve on its own, and even a victory here would be a rental, not a purchase, unless he rewired how Wessex worked. The battle delivers the deposit, the reforms buy the house. Edington is a collision of logistics wrapped in a shield wall. Alfred chooses ground where his men can anchor on slope and hedge, where a horse cannot outflank, and a routed man cannot run far without meeting a ditch. The charge is not a berserk miracle, it's disciplined violence. A wall that moves as a wall. When Guthrum's line buckles, it is because it is hungry, overstretched, and surprised to meet an English army that manoeuvred like a plan instead of arriving like a rumour. The route matters, the pursuit matters more. Alfred doesn't let victory scatter into petty plunder. He drives Guthrum to a siege, starves him without offering another set piece, and then does the most dangerous thing a victorious king can do. He negotiates to build world order, not just to bask. Baptism for Guthrum, hostages, and the treaty that follows call it Wedmore by tradition. Alfred and Guthrum's by text do two crucial things. They mark borders down the Thames, up the Lear, over to Bedford, and along Watling Street. And they equalise values Dane and Englishman alike have a wergild worth honouring. That's not magnanimity, it's the cement in a joint. If trade is to continue across an armed frontier, you need a common scale for both silver and human life. If men are to live under law next to men who answer to a different king, you need to say in writing what a crime costs and where you carry the case. Alfred is building a peace his grandsons can tax. Then he starts building the skeleton that peace hangs on. The Burr system. People fetishize castles because stone photographs well. Alfred builds something more dangerous, a network. Burrs are fortified places, some on old Roman sites, some on new earthworks sited by math, not nostalgia. They are placed to guard river crossings, ring shires, interlock their patrol zones, and cover roads that matter. They are garrisoned by obligation, calibrated to hiddage, the tax assessment of land, not by ad hoc heroism. A later document, the Burgar Hiddage, names and numbers them, showing ratios that read like a spreadsheet in Old English. This many hides owe this many men to this many feet of wool. Each burr is a granary, a market, a place where smiths can repair spearheads, and where a reeve can read a royal order aloud. Together, they are a denial grid that makes wintering enemies bleed. The burr system solves three problems in one stroke. First, it gives farmers a reason to run toward, not away from, the king's agents. When a beacon flares, a defended market town that promises your family safety will get your sons into a shield wall faster than a shouted oath at a crossroads. Second, It forces enemy bands to choose between starving outside walls and risking assault on prepared earthworks whose garrisons have been gathering since the beacon was lit. Third, it creates permanent administrative nodes. Law courts sit under those walls. Tax renders stack in those storehouses. Coin straightens in those markets. Defense is the pretext. State building is the consequence. Alfred also touches the second lever that multiplies power, time on task for fighting men. The old third system, summon everyone, fight until harvest, disband, is a recipe for campaigns that end when grain ripens. Alfred splits the duty. Half the fighting men serve while the other half farm, and then they rotate. This is not modern standing army. It is scheduled military service. It means the king can plan operations that last through summer without destroying the next year's food. It means the men on duty can train and the men off duty can keep the kingdom alive. It means enemies who depend on outlasting a third run into a calendar, not a mob. Ships come next, and here Alfred's ambition outruns his shipwrights and his admirals, which is still better than outrunning nothing. He orders vessels larger than the Danes, deeper, longer, meant to tame channels and fight in estuaries. In 897, the chronicle notes a fleet action off the south coast. Mixed results. Danish hulls better in shallows, Alfred's bigger boats better in rougher water. He is experimenting in public. No English king before him had tried to make a navy policy. Even mixed results established the most precious thing in war, precedent. The next generation will build smaller or bigger as practice teaches. They will not start from scratch. If burrs and ships are the hardware, law and literacy are the operating system. Alfred's law code, the Dombok, is not a utopian fiction. It's a curated mashup that claims Moses and quotes older West Saxon and Kentish law. This is politically brilliant. You ground your writ in divine time and local memory. You update penalties, standardize procedures, and bake into the preface conservative piety that reassures the men who will have to enforce it. The point is not merely justice, it is jurisdiction. If a case can be appealed from 100 court to shire court, and rarely through an ealdorman to the king, then the king has a staircase to climb down into local disputes when it suits him, and a railing to hold when it doesn't. The education program is the quiet revolution no shield wall can dramatize. Alfred looks at his court and sees noblemen who can wield a spear but cannot read a writ. He doesn't scold, he builds. He invites scholars from Mercia and beyond the Channel, Grimbald, Plegmond, Esser, to seed a school at court and to help him translate what he thinks every administrator should know. Gregory the Great's pastoral care becomes a handbook for bishops and reeves. Orosius's history against the pagans becomes a map of the world that puts England inside a story larger than its coasts. Boethius's consolation of philosophy becomes a workshop in thinking about fortune without losing your mind. Augustine's soliloquies becomes an exercise in the self that can govern the self. He writes prefaces in Old English saying, in effect, learn this in your tongue first. Latin can wait. That is not anti-intellectual, it is industrial policy for literacy. Coinage is propaganda and policy. Alfred's pennies, struck with his name, and sometimes with a monogram, that shouts it into a circle, are not just receipts, they are promises kept in silver. They tell a market that weights and measures will not drift. They tell a burr that its reeve can demand toll in coin, that is worth the same from Dorset to London. When Alfred takes London in 86 and re-anchors it as a burr, London burr within Roman walls again, he installs a governor, his son-in-law Ethelred of Mercia, and with him predictability. The city's mints and its market laws become a lever he can push without riding there. Diplomacy is the blanket that keeps the reforms warm. The boundary with the Danelaw is not a fixed line etched in oak. It's a working frontier that needs trade rules, hostage exchanges, and norms. The treaty with Guthrum equalizes Wergils because the king understands a basic market truth. If your subjects can't get a fair hearing when dealing with Danes, they'll smuggle instead of trade and kill instead of sue. Alfred cultivates Franks as well, not to beg for help, they're busy with their mess, but to keep the mail running. Letters, gifts, marriages, these are ways to move influence along routes that don't show up on campaign maps. None of this is theatrical. It is incremental, documented, and likely infuriating. To men who miss the romance of the old ways, where honour meant riding wherever the fight was, not sitting a wall and counting sacks of barley. Alfred tolerates the grumbling because he knows what they don't. Heroism scales poorly. Systems scale. A burr kept in food for a year is 1,000 peasant families fed and 100 helmets kept out of an enemy wagon. A shire reeve who knows his writ formula can close a homicide case in weeks. A feud closes it in bodies and years. Culture follows capacity. Schools at minsters sprout under royal patronage. Scribes in burrs start keeping local records. Charters get fussier about boundaries because boundaries matter when hundreds owe specific service to specific walls. The king's prefaces mint identity as policy. Angel-Sin, the English people, as something more than West Saxon, Mercian, Kentish. It is not nationalism, as a 19th century would recognize it. It is political branding. Alfred is inventing a we that law can address, coin can pay, and God can bless on calendars standardized by bishops, who now write in a court hand he helped teach them. And there is discipline. The Chronicles 8-9-3 entries show it. Large Viking forces return under Haystein, try to play the old game, fortify at Appledore, Middleton, Benfleet, beam right up the Thames and Severn, and run into a grid that refuses to break. Forces from burrs march by here paths, army roads to block. A fleet intercepts where an army cannot march. Food is shuttled under escort. Predators run out of prey before defenders run out of garrisons. There are defeats and embarrassments. Boats wrecked, rash assaults repulsed. But the campaigns rid like accountancy, with spears. The island has learned to deny. Alfred's last decade is not victory lap serenity. It's consolidation under the shadow of mortality. He arranges his household, places competent men in the line of march. Son Edward, son-in-law Ethelred in Mercia. Daughter Ethelfled, whose talent will bloom once grief makes her a widow. He writes the kind of prefaces old men write when they're not sure the next ones will read. He dies in 1899 with an unquiet frontier and an untested succession, but with something no English king before him could bequeath, a platform. What makes Alfred revolutionary is not genius moments, though Eddington is one, but refusal to accept that Wessex has to live on tactical brilliance alone. He insists on permanent solutions to recurrent problems. Raids recur? Build places that eat raids. Men must fight and farm? Split duty. Literacy too scarce. Translate and teach. Enemies next door. Make rules to trade with them. Rules to sue them. Rules to pay for peace when fighting can't be won this week. The idea of England, an English people, a realm with predictable courts, coins, calendars, and callings, emerges not from a poem, but from a paperwork revolution kicked off by a king who thought in systems. When his son and daughter take the stage, they will test that platform the way good heirs should, by standing on it and building higher. The Danelaw will not vanish, because a treaty says a line is a line. It will shrink because burrs are expensive to reduce, and because men who once thought of themselves as Danish or English discover that law and silver make better weather than folk memory. Alfred's gift to them is not an easy map. It is a map with grid lines. Alfred leaves a platform. Edward the Elder and Ethelflad turn it into a machine. The premise is ruthless simplicity. Stop chasing armies, start annexing ground. If you seize the crossings, markets and court sites, the men living between them will discover that they have quietly changed kings without changing farms. A shield wall wins a day, a fortified grid wins a decade. Edward inherits Wessex in 89, with enemies in front and a tested playbook behind. The burr network is there, but the frontier breathes. Northumbrian fleets still raid. The Midlands are a chessboard of client kings who can switch colours overnight. The difference with Alfred's time is synchronization. Edward and his sister Ethelflad, widow of the Mercian ruler Ethelred, work as a two-king system, without the titles to scare their allies. He in Wessex, she in Mercia, sharing blood, letters, scouts, and intent. The Lady of the Mercians is not a mascot. She issues orders, builds fortresses, leads armies, and writes charters that bind men who grew up sneering at West Saxon writ. Strategy hardens after 910. A great Northumbrian raiding host comes south and is smashed at Tettenhall. That victory removes the perpetual northern knife that had made every southern campaign a race against the next raid. Edward and Ethelflad stop thinking in terms of expeditions and start thinking in terms of rings. Each new burr is placed so it covers a river line, overlaps a neighbour's patrol distance, and throws a Saxon law shadow that reaches into Danish counties without ever marching a mile. Fortify Bridgenorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Edisbury, Warwick. Take the old Roman bones and clothe them with new earth. Garrison by Hiddage, feed by render, hold by court. They don't try to erase the dandy law by rubbing, they overwrite it by printing. The 5 boroughs, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, are not just points, they are hubs at the ends of spoke rivers and drove roads. Ethelflad takes Derby in 917, losing 4 of her best thegns in a fight that tells you how hard the street fighting was, and Leicester submits soon after. Edward bites off Bedford, then eastward. Everywhere the pattern repeats. Take the town, accept the submission, leave the farmers where they are, install an ealdorman who can collect, judge, and call out service on a calendar. Danish law isn't outlawed, it is domesticated. If a market stays open, men will trade with the new reeve. They'll grumble about language at the court door, then spend the coin with the king's face on it. Ethelfled is not only a general, she is her own PR shop. She founds and endows St. Oswald's at Gloucester, moving the cult of an old Northumbrian king south into a Mercian shrine. That is religious logistics. Import a saint, export legitimacy. When she fortifies Chester and manipulates its river defences, she turns a frontier city into a Mercian hinge that can host Welsh kings at assemblies and swing forces east or west without leaving the safety of walls. Her court is a school for power. One of its pupils is her nephew, Athelstan. In 911, Ethelred dies. Edward takes direct control of London and Oxford, the mercantile throat, and the river gate, and allows Ethelflad to rule Mercia as lady. The results are immediate. Between 911 and 918, sister and brother throw up a maker's mark of new burrs and push the frontier like a slow, heavy plough. The chronicle entries feel like a metronome. A fort built, a town taken, a submission recorded. There are no epic poems about ditch digging, But those ditches are the plot. Ethelflad dies in 918 at Tamworth just as York's notables are dangling submission. The timing is brutal, so is Edward's response. He moves fast, neutralizes rivals, and quietly deposes his niece Elfwerd. It is cold politics, and it works. Mercia is now functionally part of a single royal system, even if the heralds haven't updated the letterhead. He convenes northern and western kings, Welsh rulers, northern princes, to witness charters that frame him not only as a king over Wessex and Mercia, but as a father and lord to men who like the safety net his grid throws under their throne. The map that Ethelflad and Edward draw, with earth and oaths, allows their successor to write in ink. Aethelstan becomes the first king of a realm we can call England, without qualifying footnotes. He is primed for it. Raised in Mercia, blooded by campaigns, literate enough to understand what a charter can do in a room full of knives, Aethelstan inherits in 924–925 and acts like a man who knows that a brief window is open. He starts by setting the outer doors. The Cornish boundary is dragged to the Tamar and locked. Exeter's walls are stiffened, and a mixed population inside them learns that the city answers south and east, not west. To the north, fate assists. Sitric of York, Danish king, and Ethelstan's short-lived in-law. Aethelstan moves fast, takes York, and meets the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde at Emont to stage a choreographed submission. Whether every bow was heartfelt is irrelevant. The message is, the North Sea's southern shore is one crown now, and if you want to trade at London, or keep the peace on your marches, you will write letters that begin to the glorious Eth. He acts like a unifier, not just a conqueror. Law codes at Greatly and elsewhere regularize markets, require weights and measures, and bully sheriffs into honesty. He standardizes coinage types and forces the mint network to behave like a single instrument. Pennies with clear legends and a cross you can cut, and not devotional trinkets, but anti-clipping tech and brand control. He multiplies mints in the newly integrated zones, so men in Lincoln and York use the same fiscal language as men in Winchester. He redraws shires where old Mercian divisions don't fit the new reality and populates them with reeves trained to make writs matter. He leans on bishops, not to be holier, but to be better managers. Synods meet, rules are copied, dues are extracted. He also goes international by design. Aethelstan can leverage the channel the way earlier kings leveraged rivers. He becomes a fixer of marriages for continental rulers and a magnet for fosterlings with pedigrees. The court at York and Winchester is suddenly cosmopolitan. Breton envoys, Norwegian princes, Frankish exiles who need a safe seat and can pay in ships or swords. When he sends his half-sister to marry the future Otto the Great, he's not playing romantic diplomat. He's building a phone tree that will answer when the Irish Sea spews fleets. The coalition that forms against him in 927 is a backhanded compliment to that success. Constantine of Scotland, the king of the Strathclyde Britons, and Olaf of Dublin coordinate for a strike that should have been impossible a generation earlier. They are betting that the new English crown is a facade stitched over brittle loyalties. Aethelstan forces them to carry that bet into a pitched battle. Brunanburh, wherever the archaeologists finally pin it, becomes a slaughterhouse and a signal. The English army that meets the coalition is not a tribal levy, it is a coordinated assembly of shire forces used to marching to pre-arranged points. Supplied from burghs that know how to feed a summer's campaign, led by men who have been promoted for being useful, not for being charming at a feast. The famous poem exults because it can feel what has changed. Kings of Scotland and Strathclyde run north. The Irish Sea spits ships and takes them back. half empty, and the English pursue not as raiders but as the police of a new order. Victory doesn't turn the island into a monastery. Northumbria will still slip the leash after Athelstan dies in 909. The Irish Sea will still cough up men who think tribute is the only honest language. But the structural work is done. The shire system runs across Mercia and into the old Danelaw. Law courts convene on calendars that match. Coinage types change across the realm when the king says they do, generating both seigniorage for the treasury and uniformity for the market. Bishops and ealdormen operate as partners and rivals inside a cage. The crown built and holds the keys to even the rhetoric changes. Royal titles begin to bulge. King of the English, Emperor of all Britain, because the crown is no longer a warlord's helmet. It's a management position for an archipelago of institutions. Athelstan dies in 929, and men who never loved him exhale. But his settlement is sticky in the way only systems are sticky. Boys who came of age under his coin and his courts will not forget how a summons feels when it arrives stamped and witnessed. Burgesses who watched a mint change dies because the king said so will not enjoy barons who pay in guesswork. And neighbouring kings who once spoke to Wessex and Mercia now know they are speaking to England. The island is still an argument. It is also, finally, a single sentence. Unification never solves the problem that created it. It changes its cost. Athelstan's death in 959 tests the welds. Northumbria slips loose to a Norse king from Dublin. The Irish Sea alliance returns. The river routes wake up. What decides the century is not whether England can win battles. It can, but whether the crown can control the price of peace. Edward's younger sons pick up the pieces. Edmund 99-946 fights a two-front policy, buy time where buying is cheaper than siege, kill when killing is cheaper than tribute. He loses the north early, then bites it back, first the 5 boroughs, then he dies young, and Edred 946 95-5 takes over with fewer scruples and stronger stomach. His solution to Northumbrian whiplash, local elites inviting one Scandinavian after another to govern them, is simple: break the invitation culture. Burn the monasteries that legitimize rebels, bribe when bribes cost less than campaigning, crush when terror works. In 95-4, Eric Bloodaxe is booted or killed, and York is folded back in. The chroniclers write as if the problem is solved. It isn't. It has matured.
Edwig 925-95-95-9 inherits a unified map and promptly proves that one man can still embarrass an institution. Faction at court, a quarrel with the reforming bishops, and an inability to hold respect force a mid-reign partition with his brother Edgar. Edwig dies soon after. Edgar 959-97-5, remembered as the Peaceable, is the first English king who gets to test what peace means when you have the tools to enforce it. He doesn't waste the chance.
Edgar's settlement is not romantic. It is regulatory. He backs the Benedictine reform of Dunstan, Athelwold, and Oswald, not for incense, but for accountants. Monasteries refounded on strict rules are richer, literate, and loyal if you pick the abbots. They buffer the crown against turbulent Thigians and provide a trained pen class that can run shire government without inventing Latin as they go. He standardizes coinage across a vastly expanded mint network, drives periodic type changes that force everyone to bring in old pennies for reminting and a handy royal cut, and insists on a single standard of weight and fineness. He plays the market as policy. If you want to buy cloth in York or fish in London, you will do it with coin that looks like every other coin, and the dies will have been sent from the centre. He moves the levers of image too. The 973 Bath coronation, the choreographed oil and oath spectacle later kings will imitate, is not vanity. It tells every ealdorman and every bishop that the crown is holy, oil-slicked, and permanent. The famous boat scene on the Dee at Chester, less certain in detail than in meaning, projects Dominion kings of the far corners rowing the English king's barge, is propaganda aimed at shore and sea. And Edgar's law codes are quietly ferocious: order in markets, penalties for ravaging, an obsession with theft that is really an obsession with making commerce safe. It works until it doesn't. Around 980 the weather changes. Not the climate, the incentives. Scandinavian polities have cohered. Ambitious kings and jarls can mobilize fleets that are not summer hobbies, but state projects. England's wealth is visible on every market day and every monastery feast, its coinage, uniform, high grade, available in quantity, functions like a neon sign flickering over the channel. 8 this for silver. The Second Viking Age is not simply a rerun. It is professionalized pressure. Raids hit the south coast, the Thames, the east Dorset, Hampshire, the great markets. In 91 a large fleet descends on Essex, and English thanes stand at Maldon to stop them. They fail. The poem remembers Barfnost's offer mode, excess of spirit, when he allows the enemy to cross a narrow causeway for a fair fight. Forget moralizing. The real lesson is that fairness is for courts. The fleet extracts a massive payment, £10,000 of silver, and a groove is cut. It is not a defeat. It is an invoice for the next visit. Ethelred 97-8 it 1016. Mocked by later tradition as unread, ill-advised, has been blamed for everything. Some of it he earns. Much of it is structural. He comes to the throne a boy in blood-soaked circumstances, his half-brother Edward the Martyr murdered, and rules a realm of great wealth and increasingly privatized power. His job is to turn that wealth into defense, while local magnates treat the king's peace as a service they may purchase on Tuesdays. He has tools, law codes, Wantage, Woodstock, Enham, that demand shipbuilding and weapon purchase, a shire system that can, on paper, levy a ship from every 300 hides and helmets, and mail from every 8, a coinage system that can fund policy via reminting cycles. He even has advisors with brains. Dunstan early on, and later men who can count. But every policy now runs on money, and money has side effects. Enter Danegeld. Pay a fleet to go away, and it will. This season. Pay often, and going away becomes an industry. The numbers climb: £10,000 after Meldon, later 16,000, then 24,000, eventually 36,000. Finally spikes that make treasures blink. English fiscal capacity rises to meet demand. So does Scandinavian appetite. The silver has to be raised in hides and coins. That requires exactions that bite into the same local elites who must then love the king enough to fight for him. Some do, some don't. Meanwhile, the Irish Sea and Baltic throw up leaders who are not gifted amateurs but state actors. Olaf Tryggvason, Sween Forkbeard, Thorkel the Tall. In 1994, Olaf and Sween hit London, burn and raid in the southeast, and leave only after another heavy geld and a treaty that tries to convert a pirate into a guest. In 102, Athelred orders a mass killing of Danish men on St. Brice's Day, probably targeted killings in towns, not a general pogrom. It is meant to cauterize internal threat. It looks like weakness and malice instead. Among the dead may be a woman with ties to Sween's house. Whether or not personal vengeance drives him, political logic does. He arrives in force thereafter. The English try everything. They call out the Fard. They put fleets to sea. They appoint strongmen to coordinate regions. Sometimes it works. In 109, Dan 12, Thorkel's army lands and range burns. The English assemble one of the largest navies they've ever built. Hundreds of ships, only to see a storm, delay, and bad blood between magnates dissolve the advantage. A treacherous or simply self-interested ealdorman, Edric Streona, the grasper, will become the poster boy for a deeper problem. When the crown rents loyalty with cash and offices, men will shop. It is easy to sneer at Ethelred's ill counsel. Harder to solve his equation. He has to raise hard cash quickly across a realm of proud local powers. He must coordinate armies that are summoned by law, but led by men who can defect without losing their heads. He must arm ships faster than the Danes can build them. And he must do it while enemies learn English administrative rhythms from each last season's campaign. He promulgates laws at Enham in 108 that mandate shipbuilding and gear. He reorganizes coinage types, pushing frequent changes that force old silver back to the mint and yield a cut to the treasury. He courts the church, makes gifts to shrines and abbeys whose monks can remind God whom to favour, and plays the marriage card with Normandy, wedding Emma, sister of the Norman Duke, in hopes of securing the Channel's western gate. The attacks intensify anyway. In 113, Sweyn arrives with a campaign plan, not a shopping list. He targets the river arteries, the market towns, the submission ladders. Danelaw zones flip to him easily. Southern towns calculate. London holds fortified, rich, stubborn. Ethelred flees to Normandy, with Emma and the younger sons. Sweyn is accepted as king by most of the realm. He dies abruptly in early 1014, and the English elite, sensing the cost of starting over under a foreign dynasty, invite Ethelred back, if he will rule better than before. That phrase is a diagnosis masquerading as mercy. It means we will give you one more chance to make the state work. He tries. He buys Thorkey and his men off the market and onto the payroll, turning predators into mercenaries. It's pragmatic and expensive and temporary. In 1015, Swyn's son, Sinnut, returns with a great host and partners and lessons learned. England answers with two kings in effect. Ethelred, failing, and his son Edmund, not failing, later called Ironside, for reasons the sources don't have to invent. Edmund's campaign in 1016 is a masterclass in playing a bad hand hard, quick marches, relief of sieges, forcing battles that don't annihilate, but do delay, rallying the heartland while the heart is failing. He wins at Otford, Sherston perhaps a draw, and at Brentford he throws Sinnut back from London. He then loses at Assendoon, October 1016, where treachery or collapse breaks the English line, and the slaughter is ugly. The settlement that follows is pure exhaustion. They divide the kingdom. Sinnut gets the lion's share. Edmund keeps Wessex. Edmund dies weeks later. Sinnut is king of all England. Pause and audit, because the cliché version of these years, unready king pays off Vikings and loses, misses what actually happened to England as a state. First, the fiscal machine that paid Danegeld is not a fluke. It is a remarkable administrative instrument that can call in silver from scores of mints and hundreds of shires on schedule. The very uniform coinage that made England appetizing made centralized taxation possible. Second, the law codes mandating ships and weapons, the hiddage assessments, and the capacity to convene shire and 100 courts on demand show a government that has shifted from heroic to bureaucratic muscle. Third, the habit of buying timegeld as policy was cynically rational in a world where an enemy can always go around your wall. The failure wasn't that England used silver to fight, it's that it rarely matched the money with unity at the top when unity mattered most. There is also a cultural economy to count. Towns in the old Danelaw, York, Lincoln, Stamford were not foreign by 1,000. They were engines of trade that shipped cloth and grain under English law and Dane surnames. The church reform that had armed Edgar with abbots now arms Ethelred with literate propagandists and negotiators, saints' cults, Cuthbert in the north, Edmund in the east, anchor regional identity within a national frame. Royal image-making switches to crisis mode, charters plead for order, law codes snarl at thieves, gifts to monasteries, purchase prayers the way Danigeld purchases seasons. The realm is coherent enough to be predictably shaken. Finally, the men across the sea have changed. These are not the scratch raiders of 865. They are kings and jarls who can bring fleets and keep them. Swin and Knut run Denmark like a base. Olaf runs Norway with missionary zeal and pragmatic piracy until he doesn't. The Second Viking Age is as much about state formation in Scandinavia as it is about English weakness. When states fight, treaties and taxes become weapons. England discovers that first and pays in silver to learn the lesson. In 1016, the English crown falls to Synod, not because the country lacked laws or coin or courage. It falls because the system could not make its magnates move in one cadence, long enough to exploit the system's own strengths, and because the enemy had learnt to aim at the system itself, mince markets, political nerve centres, rather than just at undefended abbeys. Cut will inherit a realm that can fund, feed, and obey a strong king. He will use it to build something the island has not seen before, a monarchy that faces north as comfortably as south, and a court that thinks in sea lanes as well as shires. But that is the next chapter's work. For now, the audit stands. England ends the 10th century richer, more urban, more literate, and more governable than it began it. Those are the very traits that drew fleets like iron draws lightning. The surprise is not that lightning struck, it's that the structure did not burn down with the roof. Cnut will walk into a hall built by his enemies' fathers and find that the benches are already set for a kind of kingship he can understand and improve. Conquest is easy to narrate and hard to govern. Cnut walks into a hall the English built, courts, coins, shires, ships levied by law, and understands a simple truth that had eluded men who came to plunder. If you sit in the king's seat, the machine works for you. If you smash the seat, the machine eats you. He keeps the seat. The settlement begins in blood and appointments. After Arsendun, Cfanfactasichtine, and the brief partition with Edmund Ironside, Cnut becomes sole king on Edmund's death and does the things winners do to prevent replays. He trims the tree. Some ancient houses are cut down, others are bent, grafted, and watered. He retains English instruments, Witten, shires, reeves, law codes, but staffs their nerve centres with men who will not hesitate when he knocks. He breaks England into great earldoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, units large enough to be useful, small enough to be replaceable, each granted to a man whose power is personal, but whose office is the king's. Thorkel the Tall, a wolf-turned-watchdog, gorges on East Anglia before politics send him to Denmark. And back, Edric Strona, treachery incarnate, collects his final payment from an act. Into the gaps rise Englishmen, who will matter for a generation, Godwin in the south, Leofric in the Midlands, and soon Siward in the north. Local aristocrats recalibrated as royal managers within a Scandinavian calculus. Tax is not abolished, it is professionalized. The hated Danigeld, a ransom extracted by enemies, morphs under Kent into Herigeld, a predictable levy to maintain what the Chronicle calls the ship force and the king's household troops. The housecarls, that word matters. It means a salaried, drilled, oath-bound cadre that is loyal not to a region, but to a person who pays in silver that does not bounce. Housecarls fight differently from levy men. They train to hold a line and to strike on command. They can march with fewer wagons because their pay secures food in advance. They are the standing muscle that turns an annual king into a daily king. Coinage and recoinage continue like clockwork because Sittard knows the English mint system is a lever no Scandinavian ruler owns at home. He orders periodic type changes that force old pennies back into the dies and are cut into the treasury. The network, dozens of mints from York to Exeter, spits out uniform silver with his name and, crucially, the name of the moneyer and mint, which makes cheating locally prosecutable centrally. That is more than fiscal neatness. It binds elites who profit by minting into a habit of obedience to the monarch who controls the dies. Law is not a foreign import. It's a conservative manifesto in a new voice. Cunard's law codes, issued at gatherings like Oxford and Winchester, proclaim peace and protection for church markets and the king's highways. They reiterate wergilds and procedures railing against theft, false weights and private vengeance. They smell like continuity, because continuity is the point. Englishmen must feel that the king who speaks Danish at dinner will speak English in court, and when he speaks Danish at dinner, the company includes bishops. Cunard purchases legitimacy the way kings always have, with God, gold, and marriages. He marries Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred, and mother of Edward and Alfred, thereby snapping a cord to the Norman coast and adopting a queen whose bilingual pen can write to Rome as well as Rouen. He leans into the Benedictine reformers, patronising New Minster and Old Worcester and Ely, cultivating Dunstan's heirs, Ethelnoth at Canterbury, Wulfstan at York. Men who preach obedience and can talent royal policy into Sunday homilies. He goes to Rome in 1027, and the journey is not a pilgrimage cosplay, it's diplomacy. He meets an emperor, Conrad II, a pope, and a crowd of envoys who learn to pronounce cunt as a fact of European politics. The letters he sends home afterward read like minutes from a summit. Tolls eased for English pilgrims, promises made about justice, a king of the North Sea speaking the language of Christendom fluently. The North Sea Empire is not fantasy cartographers invented to fill blank space. It's a fiscal military reality stitched by ships and hostages. Denmark becomes Cunard's after 118, a homeland turned base. Norway is wrestled into the Commonwealth in 1028, when Snut leverages discontent against Olaf Haraldsson, buys friends, hires fleets, and makes Trondheim bow without burning his English treasuries to ash. The Baltic and Irish Sea now touch the same accounting book. Tribute flows from Scottish and Welsh kings when it suits. In 1031, Malcolm of Scotland and others make gestures of submission that matter because they're public, and because they can be converted into coin, hostages, and non-aggression, that free the king to pivot. Administration does not romanticize itself. It trains. Earls are instructed to keep the king's peace and to appear at court on schedule. Shire courts meet under sheriffs, who carry writs stamped with seals that function as portable presents. Bridge repair and borough defences are not back-burner chores. They are mandatory under the ancient Trinoda necessitas that Cunard happily enforces: bridge work, fortress work, military service. If your bridge falls in flood and raiders cross because you shirked, the fine lands like a tree on your hall roof. England's navy, under Sinnett, is not a peasant flotilla, summoned in panic. It is a scheduled asset. Hulls are assessed and built by law, one ship per 300 hides of land, and manned by men who know they will be paid and fed. A fleet that can hold the Thames against Norse opportunists can also carry the king around his realm faster than his rivals can conspire. And when Denmark calls, those same ships ferry housecarls and earls to Skyen or the Kattegat to put out fires before they become arsons. Propaganda glues it all. Wulfstan of York's thunderous sermons, the Sermon of the Wolf, do not only warn sinners, they reassure the anxious that God scourge the Danes has become God scourge holder, the Danish king. Royal charters decorate prefaces with biblical cadence. This king defends churches, protects widows, punishes thieves, loves peace. Saints' cults get endowed strategically. Edmund at Bury becomes a royal partner in East Anglia, a former martyr of Danish arrows, now patronized by a Danish king who understands that sanctity can be securitized if you build stone and endow land. The irony is intentional. It neutralizes grievance by feeding it. For a decade and a half, the machine hums. That's what empires really are. Hums predictable noise, made by predictable payments, producing predictable obedience. Knut rotates personnel so no earl thinks of his earldom as property. He promotes Godwin, a capable South Country operator who marries into the Danish elite, to supersize Wessex when it suits, and trims him when it doesn't. He keeps Leofric's Mercia as a counterweight, and lures Siward from the north with prospects fat enough to make killing and governing interchangeable in his mind. Then the premise wobbles, not because the structure is flawed, but because mortality is policy's most relentless opponent. Cnut dies in 1035. The empire does not explode. It unzips along the seams known to every courtier, sons, mothers, and the distances between harbours. Harthacnut, Emma's boy, the legitimate heir in the eyes of Norman clerics and many English magnates, is in Denmark fighting off Norwegian and Swedish pressure. In England, the senior present son is Harold, nicknamed Harefoot, born of Elfgifu of Northampton. Elfgifu and her faction, smart and fast, present Harold as regent, then king. The Witan, the earls, the bishops, men who prefer a decision to civil war, choose stability over theory and agree. Emma is shoved out. Her younger sons by Ethelred, Edward and Alfred calculate from Normandy. The interregnum is a stress test. Harold's regime relies on the Godwin-Leofric-Siward triangle holding. It does, barely and locally. Then England learns again how fast legitimacy turns to murder on a road. In 1036, Alfred Atheling sails from Normandy. Whether to visit his mother or to test the waters is irrelevant, and Godwin intercepts him. The prince is seized, his men are dismembered. Alfred is blinded and dies of his wounds. The act is theatre and message. Do not import kings while current ones breathe. It stains reputations, Godwin's most of all, but it works. Harold consolidates and rules until Harthacnut arrives with a fleet and a treasury. Harold dies and succession without battle presents England with a rare gift, a do-over. Harthacnut's short reign, 1040–142, is a mirror that flatters no one. He has to pay the fleet that brought him and fund the dominance that keeps Norway away and Denmark intact. The exactions feel like a tax hike after a holiday. He leans on old allies. Godwin, Leofric, Siward, restores Emma's position and does something politically precious. He invites his half-brother Edward, Emma's son by Ethelred, back and begins presenting him as heir. It is a domesticating act aimed at both England and Normandy. When Harthacnut dies at a drinking feast, fate's cruelest and most common termination protocol, the realm slides Edward into the chair without a sword drawn. Audit the Senate years and the interlude that followed, because understanding what stuck explains what breaks later. First, institutional continuity is the star. Senate did not Danishize England. He made England's shires and mints and courts serve a North Sea strategy. That choice preserved the machine that his successors, native or foreign, would inherit. Second, The earldom model matured, sub-kingship in all but name, checked by rotation, balanced by rivals. That solves the problem of scale and creates the problem of magnate ambition. Third, the housecarl, he-regaled combination proved that England could field permanent force without hallucinating a cavalry that its landscape and economy did not support. Fourth, the church-state alliance reconsecrated kingship as law and order rather than perpetual expedition. And the mint system's type changes taught elites to tolerate central intervention in their pockets, so long as weights, measures, and market peace improved. The costs are the seed of the next crisis. Earls accustomed to being regional CEOs will not applaud a king who treats them as clerks. A court fluent in Norman and Danish and English will, in the absence of a dominant personality, polarize into families and languages. A state rich enough to hire fleets is rich enough to attract claimants who can promise to cut taxes after they land. And a people who survived a foreign dynasty by leaning on institutions will someday discover that institutions cannot force an heir to be competent, present, and fertile at the same time. When Edward the Confessor takes the throne in 1042, he inherits an English kingdom that is rich, orderly, and governed by men whose offices make them dangerous. He also inherits a memory of Danish kings who ruled competently, and a frontier, a Norman duchy that calls him kin. The next chapter is not about Vikings. It is about how a court arranges itself around a king who prays like a monk, remembers like an exile, and governs in a room full of earls who know how to count. Edward comes home a crowned guest. The crown is English. The inner circle he trusts is not. 25 years in Normandy, half-brother to dukes, house-guest to abbots, have given him piety, taste, and a Rolodex, not an English patronage network. He inherits the machinery Knut tuned shires, mints, law, and the men Knut empowered Godwin of Wessex, Leofric of Mercia, Siward of Northumbria. If he expects the apparatus to obey his finger without first feeding its operators, he will learn fast. Initial moves are conservative, confirm earls, renew peace, requine is scheduled, and signal continuity in law. But the court's texture shifts. Normans and other Frenchmen begin to appear, clergy who can read papal letters without an interpreter, warriors who carry reputations as much as swords. Edward prefers men who were in the rooms where he grew up. Robert of Gimiers becomes Bishop of London, and in 1051, Archbishop of Canterbury, Ralph of Mantes, a Norman kinsman, gets an earldom in the Marches. Gifts to monasteries flow west over the Channel as readily as they flow up the Thames. None of this is treason. All of it is a signal. The Godwin calculus changes from patience to panic. Godwin, now Earl of Wessex and father of a brood whose marriages and offices knit southern England, did not rise under cart by being sentimental. He carried the south for the Danes. He carried Cart's sons through transition. He probably signed off on Alfred's death. He married a Danish noblewoman, Githa, to prove to Scandinavians that his house was a bridge, not a toll gate. Under Edward, Godwin expects to be what he has been, indispensable. Watching Normans absorb the king's attention and offices feels like an insult. Watching Robert of Gimiers seize Canterbury, spiritual capital, and a patronage hoard feels like a threat. The flashpoint is 1051. Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's in-law and an international nuisance, rides through Dover with his men, insists on quarters, and triggers a riot. Townsmen dead, Normans dead, tempers flaming. Edward demands that Godwin, whose jurisdiction includes Dover, go punish his own people. Godwin refuses. The quarrel rockets to the Wheaton and to the field. Earls align. Leofric and Siward, suspicious of Godwin's southern bloc and not eager to die for Dover, back the king. Godwin and his sons Harold, Sweyn, Tostig, bring armies to London, and discover that numbers don't guarantee victory when the centre holds, and the Pope can be invited into the argument. The family opts for exile. Godwin flees to Flanders. Sweyn, already a liability, goes on a penitential tour that ends in death. Harold and the younger brothers sail to Ireland. Edward enjoys a year that feels like vindication. He reconfigures the map, redistributing Godwin's earldoms, promoting Normans and compliant English nobles, and basking in the counsel of men who speak his language and share his comfort with relics, Rome, and continental politics. The new Archbishop, Robert, pushes hard. He accuses Godwin of Alfred's murder, pressures the Queen, Godwin's daughter, Edith, into a nunnery-like separation, and treats Canterbury as a Norman forward base. The air tastes like victory. It is ozone before a storm. The storm arrives on sails. In 1052, Godwin and Harold return with fleets. Godwin from Flanders with continental help, Harold from Ireland with ships and a talent for seamanship that will matter later. They exploit the coast, hopping town to town, collecting men and goodwill from boroughs that remember Godwin's largesse and resent Norman hauteur. Edward's fleet fails to trap them. Winds delays, perhaps sabotage by crews who prefer Godwin to Robert. The earls do their math again. Leofric and Siward are many things. Suicidally loyal is not one. London fills with rumour and opinion. The city's gates open to the stronger will. Godwin stands in the hall he once dominated, offers arbitration, and lets politics do what swords would only complicate. The Witan votes with its nerve endings. Robert of Jumiages flees. Other foreigners are allowed to slink away. Edith is restored to the Queen's chair. Stigand takes Canterbury irregularly without the pallium, a walking symptom of the regime's pragmatic illegality. Edward frowns, prays, and yields. He has a throne. Godwin has England south of the Thames. What follows is not paralysis. It's a recalibration managed by sons who can actually govern. Godwin dies in 1050. Legend makes it dramatic, mid-feast, mid-imprecation, and Harold inherits Wessex, the machine's biggest gearbox. In the north, Siward's death in 1055 allows Edward or Harold's coalition to install Tostig, Harold's brother, as Earl of Northumbria. Leofric still holds Mercia until 1057, after which his son Elfgar keeps the Midland lamp lit. The map is now a family portrait with two fault lines, Harold versus Tostig, blatant, and Godwinson's versus Mercian House, perpetual. External pressure keeps officials honest. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, a Welsh prince with real talent, unifies Wales and raids the March, reminding the English that the periphery is never passive. Harold leads expeditions west, with success measured in burnt halls and forced submissions. In 1063, he and Tostig coordinate a pincer that crushes Gruffydd naval pressure and inland marches, after which Welsh kings sign and sing. Harold's star rises because he is the man who arrives with resources, letters, and logistics, not just oaths and arrogance. At court, Edward leans into piety. He begins the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey on a scale England has not seen in stone since Rome. Romanesque mass rising on Thorny Island, a prayer in limestone that doubles as a royal mausoleum, and a political manifesto. This is the King's Church, not Canterbury's. The Abbey's dedication, December 1065, will be the last great festival of his reign. Its nave declares a taste for continental ideas and central royal liturgy. Architecture here is policy. Drag the kingdom's sacral centre west of the old city and wrap it in royal memory. Foreign policy is conducted in gestures and rumours, because the king is not fertile. and succession is a blank that invites penmanship. A trip, real or embroidered, by Harold to Normandy in 1064 will become in Norman mouths the hinge of everything. Harold, shipwrecked or blown ashore, is received by Duke William, tours castles and courts, fights a campaign in Brittany by the Duke's side, and allegedly swears an oath. Hands on relics, the Norman story insists to support William's claim to the English throne. Is the oath real? Is it coerced? Is it binding if sought by fraud? The Norman answer is yes, yes, and yes. The English answer, when it will matter, will be we elect our kings. A foreign oath binds no realm. But that argument is for lawyers and papal courts. Armies will get first say. The northern fault line cracks first. Tostig's rule in Northumbria alienates his Thegans' southern manners, in a region with its own laws, its own sense of privilege, and a short fuse for outsiders. In October 1065, the Northumbrians revolt at York, kill officials, plunder the Earl's treasury, and invite Morcar, brother of Edwin of Mercia, to take the earldom. Harold rides north as mediator, weighs the country's mood, and chooses the realm over his brother. Tostig is deposed and exiled. The message is brutal. Harold can govern. Harold can compromise. Harold can cut family to save a kingdom. The corollary is also brutal. Tostig will not forget or forgive. Edward's health fails as the year dies. On 5 January 1066, the confessor finishes the quietest claim to sainthood a medieval king could make: chastity, churches, and a court that thinks his miracles might begin any day. He leaves no son. He leaves an abbey still smelling of plaster and incense. He leaves a Wheaton that has discovered, over 30 years of crisis management, that it can act like a board of directors when a crown needs a head. On 6 January, they elect Harold Godwinson, the man who can move armies and rice sacks. He is crowned, probably by Stigend, the canon law irregularity that will later give Rome a post facto fig leaf for Norman arguments, and immediately behaves like a man who knows what the horizon holds. He places men where coasts need them, watches the sea, and waits. Claims coalesce like storms. William of Normandy shapes a narrative that makes Harold a perjurer, and himself a guardian of order. The confessor, he says, promised him the crown. Harold swore to support it. The Pope, lured by promises of reform and clearer ties to Rome, furnishes a banner and perhaps a ring, sacralizing invasion as crusade before crusade. In Norway, Harold Hardrad, a giant in body, and C.V., veteran of Byzantine wars, claimant by an old pact between Harthacnut and Magnus of Norway, calculates that England, unified by Danes once, might welcome a Scandinavian emperor. In Flanders, in Brittany, in every harbour where men weigh risk and profit, ships are caulked and whispers are counted as coin. Harold plays defence with a realist's economy. He cannot stop rumours. He can garrison coasts. He stations forces in the south because William's fleet is real, and he performs the dull work that keeps a levy from rotting. Rotate men home for harvest, keep housecarls paid, keep ships supplied. Summer becomes a test of endurance, of the king's purse and the farmer's patience. By September, the South Coast Watch must stand down. Bread does not grow in arsenals. The blow falls from the wrong quarter, because the wronged brother owns a compass. Tostig returns with a fleet, joins forces with Hardrada, and sails for the Humber. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, marshal at Fulford and Lewes. York submits. The invaders make the mistake all invaders love, demanding hostages and supplies at a comfortable distance from ships. Harold marches north with a speed that does not read as plausible until you put him in the shoes he wore in Wales and Wessex. A man with here paths in his head and housecarls who do not straggle. On 25 September 1066 at Stamford Bridge, he catches Hardrada and Tostig on the wrong side of a river, gearlight, courtesy of victory. The battle is annihilation. Hardrada dies with an arrow in his throat. Tostig dies with his grievance intact. The Norwegian fleet limps home with a handful of ships.
It is the last unallied good news Harold will ever hear. 2 days later, William lands at Pevensey, and then Hastings. Good harbours on a coast. Harold just denuded to save the north. Castles prefabricated timber mortars prout like teeth. William does not seek a pitched battle on Harold's terms. He seeks to lock a base, ravage enough to provoke and fight on ground he picks. Harold force marches south because he must. He cannot let the southeast bleed under the nose of his new crown. He cannot sit in London while a duke fortifies Sussex into Normandy-on-Thames. The shield walls that have saved England for centuries will be asked to save it once more, and the arguments about oaths and papal banners will be settled between hedges.
Stop the tape there, because this chapter's work is to explain why the battle that follows is not just a contest of swords, but a referendum on systems. Edward's reign proved that piety without patronage breeds factions, that earls scaled to save a realm can, if not managed, rival it, that Westminster in stone cannot alone anchor succession in flesh. Harold's brief reign proved that administrative competence can win wars of weeks, but not erase oaths whispered in foreign halls, or invasions blessed by foreign altars. England enters October 1066, with money, law, ships, and men who know how to march. It also enters with a king whose legitimacy is native and immediate, and enemies whose claims are international and prepared. What happens on Sandlak Hill will decide whether the English machine continues under a house that grew up in Sussex, or under a house that grew up across the Channel and plans to import castles and a new language of power to sit on top of an old language of law. Either way, the state Alfred built, Cunnet tuned, and Edward preserved in parchment will not vanish. It will be made to serve someone else's story. At dawn on 14 October 1066, the hill at Senlac is a problem in geometry. Harold has the high ground, the hedge, the shield wall. William has 3 arms, archers, infantry, cavalry, and a banner from Rome that says his cause is therapy, not theft. The fight is not knights versus peasants, it's system versus system. Phase 1 is simple. Arrows soften, infantry presses, cavalry tests the edges. It fails. The English wall huscarls in front with long axes. They jungs and seal brace behind, turns horses and men into broken piles. Where the slope steepens, mailed riders lose momentum and nerve. Where the hedge thickens, spears do the rest. On another day, with another claimant, the Normans cut their losses and leave a raid's worth of dead. William does not come to raid. Phase 2 is learning in blood. Feigned flight, whether ordered or improvisation, polished into doctrine after the fact, does what arrows couldn't. It pulls impatient English off the ridge. Chunks of wall break to chase. Norman wings wheel and hit the pursuers on open ground. Harold's line compresses, reforms, fights on. The battle becomes a day-long abrasive, grinding stamina, cohesion, and command. In the last hours, the English centre is an exhausted fact rather than a plan. Harold dies, arrow or blade. It doesn't matter, the shield wall's mind goes with him. The final Norman push is not elegant. It is sufficient. William does not dash to London. He walks England into acknowledging him. He ravages where submission lags. Romney pays in blood for killing Normans from a wrecked ship, accepts hostages where towns calculate, and builds as he goes. Timber mortice with palisades that convert a march into a chain. At Berkhamsted the pivot happens. Edgar Atheling and leading men submit. At Westminster Christmas Day, a foreign king is crowned by English right.
The coronation riot guards outside mistake acclamation for revolt and set houses ablaze becomes a metaphor on day one, misunderstanding fire and the new order holding anyway.
Conquest is follow-through. Exeter tests him in Tentrys 8. William blocks trenches, starves, offers terms that save faces but not independence. Then plants a castle in the mouth of the wound. The north is worse. In Tentrys 69-70, York burns, Danes appear in the Humber, like the past refusing to die, and northern notables bet on memory. William answers with logistics, as punishment. The harrying is not a single battle, it's a season of denial, crops burned, stores destroyed, people scattered, that creates a famine remembered for generations. It is strategically effective and morally indefensible, which is how medieval states often work when the lesson they want to teach is do not rise again. Here is the core of the revolution. Land changes hands, institutions do not. William confiscates on a scale only a victorious invader can attempt and survive. By 10 E6, fewer than 10 men hold half the realm's land in chief. Almost all Old English magnates are displaced, some dead, some demoted, a few surviving ein nimble loyalty. The pyramid hardens. King at the apex, tenants in chief, lay and ecclesiastical, owing service in knights, under tenants owing service to them, peasants below paying rents and labour. But the shires stay, the hundreds meet, the geld is still assessed, the king's writ still runs, Norman tenure overlays not replaces, the West Saxon operating system. Castles are the physical expression of that overlay. Timber mottes with baileys sprout at river mouths, road knots and city rims, Tower of London policing the Thames, Winchester watching the old royal heartland, York and Lincoln re-anchoring the northeast. They are not aesthetic, they're warehouses of coercion, each garrison a standing vote in any argument about who rules within a day's ride. They let a few hundred mailed men dominate thousands without camping on the open field. Coinage and tax become levers rather than lifelines. England's uniform pennies and the geld that had once bought off Vikings now fund garrisons, campaigns and patronage. William keeps the geld even when invasion scares recede, because predictable cash does what feudal service cannot. It hires and eds on time. The king's need for visibility over what he owns, what he can squeeze, and who owes what to whom produces the most famous audit in medieval Europe. Domesday Book 10. It is sparked by real danger. Cannot V of Denmark and Robert of Flanders threaten invasion, and by royal paranoia, the healthy kind. Commissioners tour shire courts with standard questions. Who held this in King Edward's day? Who holds now? What is it worth then and now? How many ploughs, mills, fish ponds, borders, villeins, sokemen? It is not a census of souls. It is an X-ray of liability and profit. Calling it Domesday is not a joke. When the book closes, argument closes with the church is remade too, less in doctrine than in personnel and procedure. Lanfranc, imported from Bec, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070 and turns the English episcopate into a Norman management class. He redraws diocesan lines, plants archdeacons as middle managers, pushes clerical celibacy, and litigates Canterbury's primacy over York like a corporate takeover. Bishops sit in shire courts, as before, but now they speak better Latin and write more letters to Rome. Episcopal palaces become hubs where royal and papal logic intersect. Liturgical unity is a bureaucratic asset. Language follows power. Charters migrate to Latin formulas. Pleas in the Curia Regius blend Latin and the French of the conquerors. The hall still judges by custom. but the record is increasingly in a clerical hand. Inquests, juries of local men, sworn testimony, Anglo-Saxon habits of truth-finding are repurposed to feed a more writ-happy centre. Murderum fines punish communities that won't identify a slain man's killer. Frank pledge and tithing groups make neighbours mutually responsible for each other's good behaviour. Collective liability is surveillance without paperwork. Forest law is the conquest's most hated novelty because it is absolutism in trees. When William afforests, he is not planting, he is reclassifying vast tracts. Most famously, the New Forest become the king's playground and revenue stream, where game and vert are protected by savage penalties, and where customary rights, wood gathering, pasturage, shrink under the excuse that the king hunts here. Forest courts sit under a separate, harsher code. Foresters and verderers police a landscape that now speaks royal exclusivity. The legend that William created, wasteland for sport, is propaganda. What matters is that a king can, with a word, change the legal weather over your village. Resistance persists as local theatre. Hereward stirs Ely's marshes. Edric the Wild flares on the Welsh March. Northern and western bubbles rise and are skimmed. The Norman answer is consistent. Garrison, starve, buy or break, and then build a castle where the memory of resistance is strongest. By the 1080s, the map is studied with permanent arguments that a town cannot win. The conquest social arithmetic is unsentimental. English Thigurns become under-tenants or disappear. Many free peasants, sokemen, in the Danelaw keep unusual bargaining power. Elsewhere, villains and bordars work heavier, customary burdens. Yet markets do not die. Boroughs get royal charters that codify tolls and liberties. Merchants learn the French for bargaining. Guilds begin to smell like future cities. The conquest narrows the elite and thickens the middle. William himself is not a phantom behind structures. He rides like a man who knows roads are power, crossing the channel in winter to deal with Maine, back again to slap earls, north to lay waste, south to dedicate foundations. He is economical with risk. When he can buy, he buys. When he can frighten, he frightens. When he must slaughter, he does it thoroughly. He dies in 1087 in Normandy after a petty war sparked by a joke about fatness. The funeral farce, fire, theft, a grave claimed by another, would be farce if not for what follows. He had 3 sons fit to matter. Robert, the eldest, gets Normandy, as custom suggests. William Rufus II gets England as convenience demands. Henry, the youngest, gets cash. Splitting the realms is rational from the point of view of French politics, and stupid from the point of view of English security. It opens the next act, a generation learning how to run a 2-engine monarchy with 1 pilot asleep and 1 drunk. The revolution of 166 is often summarized as feudalization. That word hides the point. England did not import feudalism from a crate labelled Rouen. It took an already centralized, cash-competent, court-literate kingdom and let a foreign soldier re-key it to his grip. Castles to enforce, tenures to bind, surveys to count, bishops to legitimize, coin to collect. The price of that efficiency is permanent militarization of landscape and law. The benefit is that the machine now runs no matter whose name the money is punched into silver, so long as that name can push back earls and feed garrisons. The next kings will test that clause until it snaps. William II, called Rufus, inherits the English half of a problem. He is competent, coarse, and allergic to piety. The barons are tempted. If Robert rules Normandy and Rufus rules England, a magnate with land on both sides can play brothers against each other for lighter service and heavier favours. Rufus understands the game and plays it better. His first decade is a seesaw of war subsidies, castle building, and sudden violence. When Robert goes on the First Crusade, 1096, Rufus rents Normandy from him, cash for the Duke, control for the King, and England's revenues grease the hinge. This is the earliest clear picture of a fiscal military state in motion. The exchequer is emerging. We'll name it under his brother, sheriffs, squeeze, and the king's favour is a cash transaction. Rufus also discovers the profit centre called vacancy. When a bishopric or abbey falls empty, the king keeps its lands and incomes. Keep these empty long enough, and you've invented a revenue stream that the church calls simony and you call governance. Enter Anselm, saint in waiting, and Archbishop of Canterbury. After Rufus bullies, Anselm resists. Rome intervenes. Somebody sulks to Normandy. Fines are levied. Nothing doctrinal is solved. What is clear is the precedent. Who invests bishops is not a local quarrel. It is the frontier between a king who thinks of office as a fief and a church that is learning to think like an international corporation. Rufus dies in 1100 hunting accident in the New Forest, arrow and speculation, and Henry, the spare third son, with cash and brains, moves before rigor mortis. He seizes the treasury at Winchester, never leave the state's wallet lying around, gets crowned fast at Westminster, and publishes a pamphlet with a crown on it, the Charter of Liberties. It promises to stop the fiscal abuses everyone hates. No more selling justice like last year's horses. No more strip mining bishoprics during vacancy. No more arbitrary reliefs and wardships beyond custom. It is a campaign manifesto designed to keep earls quiet and bishops helpful while he secures the realm. It also becomes unintentionally England's first recallable checklist for judging a king. Henry marries Edith Matilda of Scotland, a great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, and in that single decision stitches Norman steel to the old royal blood. It is propaganda you can christen. Children from this marriage will claim to be both lines at once. He then does the thing the Norman system exists to do. He defeats his brother. At Tinchebray in 1106, after years of seesaw war and baronial hedging, Henry pockets Normandy. England and Normandy are reunited under one mind, and magnates with cross-channel estates lose their favourite leverage play. Now he governs like a clerk with a sword. He regularizes the exchequer, a literal checkered table where sheriffs render accounts twice a year, counters pushed on squares, tallies notched in wood, auditors trained to be cynical, pipe rolls. The annual budget book starts surviving from 1129-30, a thin papyrus door into a room of receipts and orders that has always been there. Roger of Salisbury, his justiciar, and a cadre of bishops and clerks turn Henry's personal will into institutional habit. Writs standardize, itinerant justices circulate, scutage, cash in lieu of night service becomes thinkable. The king's pleas, serious crimes are corralled into royal jurisdiction. This is not common law yet. It is common practice, regular, legible, usually profitable. He fights borders like a man who knows maps are contracts. The Welsh are pushed and bribed. Marcher lords are indulged so long as their castles point the right way. Scotland gets a lesson when it confuses matrimonial courtesy with political generosity. Continental politics are endless because the French crown, weak in theory, cunning in Paris, would love Normandy detached and disobedient. Henry's answer is always the same: more cash, more clerks, more speed. Then 1120 rips the plan. The white ship sails out of Barfleur at night, with the king's only legitimate son, William Atheling, drunk and confident. It hits a rock and sinks. Almost everyone dies trying to swim the short distance to shore. A butcher clinging to a mast tells the tale. Henry is left with one legitimate child, Matilda, once Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, widowed young, and now back in a court that never planned to accept a woman as sovereign. Henry forces the magnates to swear oaths to accept her as his heir. They swear because he is alive, because his temper is immediate, and because oaths in comfortable halls are cheaper than wars in uncomfortable fields. Succession is politics' most reliable detonator. Henry marries Matilda to Geoffrey of Anjou. Plantagenet later, a match that makes sense strategically. Anjou threatens Normandy's southern flank. Better to own what you cannot kill, and feels like an insult to Norman pride. Angevins are upstarts. Geoffrey is young. Barons swear again. Henry breathes longer than most men. He dies in 1125, full of lampreys and unfinished business. The oath proves exactly as good as the living fear that enforced it. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, moves like a man who has memorized the 100 playbook. He reaches London fast, flatters the city, secures the treasury, and gets crowned. He buys church support with promises and appointments. The early years look competent. He is affable, generous, and fatal combination. Soft on discipline, royal castles are entrusted to men who mistake custodianship for ownership. Mercenaries are hired to cover gaps. Justice starts to wobble. When Matilda and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester move, they find buyers. The Anarchy 189-153 is not Thucydides, it's municipal accounting on fire. First coinage, a mark of state failure, is that anyone with a die strikes pennies. Rebel barons open mints, the weight and fineness slide. Markets adapt with discounts and suspicion. Second, castles, adulterine, built without license, sprout like mushrooms on damp power. Every ridge near a road gets a stockade, every town a bullying neighbour. Third, allegiance, earls swap sides, because oaths are currency and both sides pay. Fourth, geography, the war is positional, not apocalyptic pockets of control around Bristol. The western shires, the Thames Valley, the east connected by raids and sieges rather than set-piece battles. There are battles. Lincoln, 1141. Stephen is brave to the point of stupidity, fights amid collapsing lines while earls calculate the exchange rate of loyalty, is captured and turns from king into hostage. The Waiton meets in Winchester. Matilda is styled Lady of the English and moves to claim London. She governs like an empress in a city that wants a market regulator. Tax demands feel like confiscation. Her temper, raised on imperial deference, meets Londoners raised on bargaining. They riot, she flees. At Winchester and the Route, her faction loses control. Stephen's queen, Matilda of Boulogne, fights like a quartermaster with claws. Robert of Gloucester is captured and exchanged for Stephen. The pendulum swings back to zero. From there, it's trench warfare by charter. Geoffrey of Anjou methodically eats Normandy from the south, castle by castle, until the duchy recognizes him, because no one else reliably pays the watch. In England, Stephen and Matilda stalemate while local lords behave like weather, sometimes fair, often foul. Towns bargain for walls and liberties. Bishops pick sides but hedge. The church under Archbishop Theobald and a rising clerk named Thomas Becket prefers order to victory. By the late 1140s, the war has settled into patterns so stable they feel like customs. Then a boy arrives who knows how to use patterns as ladders. Henry Fitz-Empress. Matilda's son with Geoffrey lands in 1147, learns the tour, and returns in 1149, older in cunning than in years. By 1151 he is Duke of Normandy by his father's death. In 1152 He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine 2 months after her annulment from the French king, snapping up half of western France in a single audacious ceremony. The map now whispers a future no one expected. If this man takes England, the Channel becomes a causeway between domains larger and richer than any Capetian king controls. Stephen has one card left, a son, Eustace, competent enough to inherit trouble and angry enough to make it. Civil war can run forever on sons. It stops when the principals tire, the pay runs out, or a famine makes every garrison's ration taste like penance. In 1153, with the country exhausted, barons broke, and the church uninterested in blessing one more siege, a truce is struck. The Treaty of Wallingford, or Winchester. Stephen keeps the crown for life. Henry is recognised as heir. Adulterine castles are to be slighted. Foreign mercenaries dismissed. Justice restored. Eustace dies conveniently soon after, taking the ugliest variable off the table. In 1154, Stephen dies. Henry walks into a treasury with spiderwebs and a realm with muscle memory. Audit the anarchy before handing Henry II the mop. First, the Norman settlement was strong enough to survive a near miss. Shires, boroughs, and many abbeys behaved as states within a state, keeping markets open and courts limping while armies played tag. Second, castles are double-edged. The same fortifications that let a king dominate a countryside let barons defy him when license slips. Third, money is central. Whoever controls mints and the sheriffs who farm revenues can keep soldiers fed and towns loyal. When coin confidence dies, so does governance. Fourth, oaths without enforcement are decoration. Henry's demand that magnates swear to Matilda meant nothing once he was dead, and the incentives shifted. Fifth, London matters. Regimes that misunderstand the city, its price sensitivity, its pride, its need for security without swagger, do not last. The anarchy taught a generation of survivors hard habits. Never leave garrisons unfed. Make royal castles royal again. Audit sheriffs. Centralize coinage. License stone. And burn timber. Make itinerant justice. A habit, not a favour. Anchor succession in competence more than theory. And above all, convert private violence into public law fast. The man who arrives in 154 has watched this movie from the front row. He will direct the sequel with a ferocity that looks like reform and feels like a verdict. Henry walks in at 21 with a realm that remembers two things: how to fight without end and how to keep markets open during chaos. He will use the second to erase the first. This is the blueprint: central cash, portable law, and men who move when parchment tells them to. Reset the board. First winter he sacks dozens of sheriffs, those local revenue lords who had turned farm the shire into farm it for myself. He drags royal castles back under royal keys and orders adulterine timber heaps slighted. He does not abolish baronial power. He makes it conditional on showing up when summoned and paying when billed. The exchequer, emerging under Henry I, becomes a habit again. Biannual countings on the checkered cloth. Tallies notched. Sheriffs sweated by clerks who know their sums and their Latin. You can smell the audit in the pipe rolls, which start surviving again. A state self-portrait in numbers. Law as logistics. Henry's real revolution is procedural. He nationalizes dispute settlement. Under the cover of custom, he manufactures precedent. Start with writs, short royal orders. You buy a chancery that command a sheriff or royal judge to do something definite. Summon, take security, convene a jury, keep the peace. Make more kinds of writ, and suddenly more kinds of quarrel are removable from a baron's hall into the king's court, because you can buy the right paper. Then institutionalize inquests. An inquest is not an argument. It's a data extraction. 12 men who know the neighbourhood are put under oath to present truths the Crown wants. Who owes what service, who stole, who was found slain. The jury of presentment, assize of Clarendon, 1166, is Henry's most subversive creation. Local communities must accuse under oath suspected felons, whereupon sheriffs and royal justices take custody. Criminous clerks, those churchmen who claimed they were only answerable to ecclesiastical courts, now have the state's spotlight on them at the first stage of accusation. This is where theology collides with policy. Parallel track the petty assizes. Novel decising gives any freeholder a fast track to recover land of which he's been recently unjustly dispossessed. Mort die ancestor secures an heir's right when a father dies. No waiting for a lord's favour. You buy a writ, a royal judge comes, or you go to him. A jury answers set questions, and you get either the land back or a verdict clean enough to appeal. The Grand Assize lets a litigant trade trial by combat for a jury of 12 knights. Outcome: fights drop, paperwork rises, royal fees flow. The king turns violence into revenue and local custom into uniform practice. The Assize of Northampton, 1126, tightens the screws. Harsher penalties, itinerant justices, 6 circuits, who carry the king's eye into every shire, sheriff explicitly leashed. The Assize of Arms, 1181, mandates weapon ownership by wealth bands and codifies who must turn out and what they bring. This is reserve mobilization policy, dressed as public order. Coin and measures matter because markets pay for judges. In 1158, Henry pushes a major recoinage, the Tealby type, fresh pennies, cleaner dies, stricter silver. In 1180, he introduces the short cross penny that will run for generations. Uniform coin is not beauty. It is trust that lets courts move fees and sheriffs settle farms without an argument in every town over what a pound is. Standardized writ fees underwrite the machine. The Becket problem. If you centralize justice in a world where the church has its own courts, your project will hit an archbishop. Henry raises Thomas Becket, his brilliant worldly chancellor, into Canterbury, 162, expecting compliance in cope and mitre. Becket converts to a man the church can use, hair-shirt piety layered over a steel reading of ecclesiastical privilege. The flashpoint is criminous clerks, tonsured men accused of secular crimes who traditionally slide into church courts and lighter sanctions. Henry's Constitutions of Clarendon, 164, write down what he claims are ancient customs. Appeals to Rome need permission. Bishops are his men in baronial cases. Clerks convicted in church of felony return to royal court for sentencing. Becket refuses the package, flees into exile, floods Europe with letters, and turns a jurisdictional quarrel into a test of whether kings can dictate what custom is. Years of maneuver follow: papal legates, royal temper, French shelter. A face-saving formula is patched up in 1170. Becket returns. Henry gets his son anointed king, a preemption move. Becket starts suspending bishops he thinks colluded. Somewhere in Normandy, Henry rants the line every medieval politics student knows by heart in one of its variants: "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? 4 knights here command under the fury, sail, and hack Becket down at vespers in his own cathedral on 20. It is catastrophe as sacrament. Blood on the stones creates the most explosive cult in the West. Pilgrims will pour silver into Canterbury for centuries. Henry will do public penance barefoot, lashings from monks. Because optics are now governant, he quietly abandons parts of Clarendon, keeps the rest by habit, and proceeds with the legal project just the same. Power concedes in sentences,
Systems win in routine.
The Great Revolt, 103-74. The shock of Becket's murder doesn't topple Henry. His sons try. The young King Henry, crowned during his father's life, wants lands, not a title that buys nothing. Richard has Aquitaine via his mother Eleanor. Geoffrey has Brittany. All want more. Louis II of France. And a thicket of barons see their chance. England fractures, earls rise, Scotland's William the Lion invades. The Count of Flanders toys with the coast. Aquitaine burns. Henry's answer is the same in all directions. Speed, money, and castles ruthlessly rekeyed. He buys or breaks fortresses in the Vexin, slaps down the earls with sieges that function as lesson plans, and gets lucky once in 1174. William the Lion is captured in a dawn surprise at Alnwick after a raid. Treaty of Falaise follows, making Scotland on paper a vassal kingdom. He follows up with a purge dressed as policy. The inquest of sheriffs, 170, had already culled corrupt officials. After the revolt, a fresh round of inspections, removals and fines. He then orders dozens of rebel castles slighted. Stone becomes gravel. Defiance becomes recollection. Ireland. A new front becomes a portfolio. Irish kings have been fighting Irish kings forever. Anglo-Norman freebooters see invitations and opportunity. In 1169-71, Cambro-Norman lords, Strongbow and Company land, carve out positions. Henry crosses in 1171 to prevent a subject from becoming a rogue king and to turn a freelance conquest into a royal asset. Synod of Cashel nods toward Roman alignment. Dublin, Waterford and Wexford are taken into a crown framework. By 1175, Treaty of Windsor recognises High King Rory O'Connor over unconquered zones, while the king holds the rest. Title Lord of Ireland is minted. Plantations of royal boroughs anchor a future that will be made of tensions and plantations. Administration as culture. The bench and bar class begins to exist. Royal Justices Glanville in the 80s and the anonymous hand behind the Tractatus de Legibus turn practice into teachable prose. Heirs circuit courts roll with files and formulas. Sheriffs learn that failure to produce a body or an answer means amassments the exchequer will not forget. Scotage, the money paid in lieu of knight service, gives the king cash instead of half-hearted barons on horseback. Carte Baronum 1166 forces barons to declare how many knights they owe. Inflated or hidden numbers get dragged into light. It is half accountancy, half counterintelligence. Edges and endings. Abroad, Henry plays the Angevin Empire like a man juggling knives on a moving cart. Normandy guarded by the Vexin, Anjou glued by terror and patronage, Aquitaine held through Richard's terror and Eleanor's legitimacy. At home the machine hums even when the operator bleeds. By the late 1180s, the sons' rebellions have become an industry. The young king dies. Geoffrey dies in Paris. Richard, aimed at his father by Philip II of France, becomes the weapon that finishes the maker. In 1189, the old king collapses at Chinon, betrayed lists in his hand, the name John burning worst. He dies knowing the system will survive him because it no longer needs his pulse to keep time. Audit the reign. Henry did not invent English law. He made royal justice the default. He did not abolish feudal service. He made it commute to coin. He did not win the church. He taught kings to publicize their defeats and continue their programs anyway. The machine he leaves writs, eyres, sheriffs on a leash, exchequer in muscle memory, will survive crusades, ransoms, incompetent heirs, and a charter barons will force into the king's mouth and the court's hands. If Henry II built the machine, and Richard I rode it abroad, John tried to drive it like a personal chariot, and stripped the gears, not because the tools were wrong, but because he used them like a man who never believed in brakes. Setup: Richard's intermission. Richard, 1199, is better on campaign than in council. He goes to crusade, gets captured on return, and the country learns a brutal lesson in liquidity. To ransom a king you squeeze every pipe. Tallage on towns and Jews, scutage on barons, the treasure chest at Fontevraud, the plate off altars. In 1194, while Richard is still a captive, the crown restarts nationwide ires and standardizes plea rolls. It is the beginning of a surviving paper trail for royal justice that reveals a state that can operate without the king's physical presence. Richard returns, thrashes Philip II in Normandy for a while, and dies at Chaluz in 1199 of a petty wound from a petty siege. His brother John takes a crown that can pay and a frontier that can't be fed forever. The lost 1200–1204. Philip II of France is a monarch who thinks in maps and mills. He knows the Angevin Empire is a web of loyalties wrapped around accidents, cut enough strands, and the spider falls. John helps. He marries Isabel of Angoulême, snatching a bride betrothed to a Lusignan, thereby kicking a power hornet's nest in Poitou. Philip summons John to his court. As Duke of Normandy, John refuses, and the French king does what overlords do to recalcitrant vassals. He declares forfeiture and attacks. Château Gaillard. Richard's brilliant river citadel falls in 1204, after a siege that showcases French engineering and English complacency. Normandy peels away. Anjou follows. Main terrain gone. Overnight, the aristocracy of two shores is cut in half. Cross-channel barons must choose. Most choose the land where Philip's sheriffs now collect. England becomes the thing it hadn't been since 1066. An island polity without a continental cushion. John's answer: pressure. He squeezes, because squeezing is what the machine allows. Scutage becomes habitual and heavy. Tollage hits towns and Jewish communities. Americans' fines become weapons. Justice is sold, delayed, or denied to suit the month's cash flow. He micromanages lawsuits to humble magnates and reward clients. Sheriffs are leased their shires for sums they can recoup by any means short of revolt. The exchequer smiles while the country winces. None of this is illegal in the narrow sense. All of it is unsustainable politically. The church front. Rome learns to be a lender of crowns. In 1205, Archbishop Hubert Walter dies. The monks of Canterbury, trying to outfox king and pope, do a midnight election. John runs his own candidate. The Pope, Innocent III, the most political mind of the century, overrules both and appoints Stephen Langton, a scholar with a spine. John refuses to accept. Innocent places England under an interdict. 1208, church bells fall silent. Burials move outside sanctified ground. Sacraments constrict. John seizes church revenues and shrugs. Innocent escalates. Excommunication. 1209, and hints at deposing. John, who will face Philip II anyway, reads the board. In 1213 he capitulates in the most breathtaking pivot of the reign. He surrenders England and Ireland as papal fiefs and receives them back as a vassal, promising a yearly payment. Overnight, the Pope becomes his overlord. It is humiliating theatre that buys him what matters: papal backing against French and baronial enemies. Innocent, now John's feudal lord, will start writing letters calling the king our vassal. That phrase is a shield. The last throw in France. Bouvines, 1214 to 114. John tries to turn the tables. Attack in Poitou. Force Philip to split. Let an allied German emperor, Otto IV, and Flemings hit him in the north. Strategy is sound. Execution collapses where John does not stand. At Bouvines, 27 July 1214, Philip smashes Otto and the allied northern host. It is a pan-European verdict, Capetian monarchy ascendant, Angevin come back dead. John, failing in Poitou, sails home with a treasury to refill and an aura of failure no writ can bleach. Revolt and a charter. The baronage has paid and bled, now it adds arithmetic to grievance. In January 1215, northern lords and others swear at Stanford to resist until liberty is restored according to Henry I's charter. London, always the kingmaker city, goes over to the rebels in May. John negotiates because he must. They bring a draft because they can. At Runnymede in June, steel on both banks of the Thames, they push a long lawyerly list across a table. The king's seal meets wax. Magna Carta is born, not as scripture but as a ceasefire agreement with teeth. Strip the romance and read the instrument. It is governance by constraints, taxation under council, no scutage or aid save by common counsel of our realm, except in 3 ancient cases. Ransom, knighting the eldest son, marrying the eldest daughter. Common council here means a summoned body bishops, earls, greater barons by individual writ, and all who hold of us in chief by a general summons to a fixed place on a fixed date. It is not parliament yet. It is the checkpoint where royal need meets baronial consent. Due process. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or disseized, save by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. 40. These are not platitudes, they are purchase orders for habit. Insert these into the bloodstream of the courts, and over decades, sheriffs and justices adjust their reflexes. Proportionality and predictability. Embarrassment's fines must fit the offence and spare a man's livelihood. 20. Weights and measures standardise across realm. 35. Fish weirs removed from the Thames and Medway. Petty. No, it's trade policy. London's liberties confirmed. 13. Because cities are banks with walls. Feudal fairness. Reliefs capped. Widows protected from forced remarriage. Guardians forbidden to waste heirs' lands. Heirs married without disparagement. It is social engineering to curb the most profitable abuses. Enforcement Clause 61 creates a council of 25 barons to distrain the king if he breaks the terms. That is not constitutional monarchy. It is legalized rebellion with committee minutes. John seals because time is a predator. Then he looks for a bigger cat. He writes to his overlord. Innocent III delivers. He annuls the charter. As base and shameful, frees John from his promises, excommunicates the rebels, and turns Magna Carta into a papal punching bag. The rebels reply with a foreign prince. Louis of France is invited to take the crown. Civil War, the First Barons' War, restarts with a French accent. Death and settlement. John is not crushed. He is unlucky and clumsy. He campaigns up and down the east, loses his baggage and part of his army to the tide in the Wash. 1216, a natural metaphor, so perfect chroniclers can't resist polishing it, and dies of illness in October with the realm half occupied, and his 9-year-old son, Henry, inheriting a crown and a bonfire. The Regency. William Marshall, the greatest knight turned greatest adult in the room, rules with 2 ideas, by time, by loyalty. Magna Carta is reissued in 1216, trimmed of the sharpest teeth, like the Clause 61 Enforcement Committee, because you can't govern with a gun permanently at your head. Marshall wins the field at Lincoln, May 1217, the Lincoln Fair, where baronial armour and French hopes sold cheap, and the sea at Sandwich, August 1217, where English ships wreck a French relief fleet. Louis negotiates his way out. In 1217, a separate forest charter is issued, shrinking the king's hunting reserves and softening forest law, because village rights are where politics live. Finally, in 1225, with Henry III old enough to grant rather than confirm, Magna Carta is reissued again in the form that will stick, now explicitly exchanged for a tax grant. That linkage liberties for supply is the hinge of later English constitutional practice. What Magna Carta actually did, it did not invent liberty. It inventoried abuses and made remedies taxable. It did not create parliament, it made common council, a phrase lawyers could drive nails with, and it taught the political class that withholding consent buys concession. It did not bind kings with mystic force, it gave courts language for saying no with references. Its genius is not a single sentence. It is the boring insistence that government must be legible, proportionate, and consultative when it wants your purse or your body. What John actually taught, that you can lose Normandy and still run England if you run it for England, not at it. That sheriffs farming shires without oversight mutate into predators. That selling justice poisons the currency courts run on. That being the Pope's vassal is a clever shield until you need your own nobility to do something dangerous. Then you discover Rome doesn't march. That a machine built by Henry II will produce cash and writs even for a man who squanders both, until the payers rename the product. What the settlement bought. A minority government, 1216, Walthen 227, under Marshal and then Hubert de Burgh, that actually governs, foreign garrisons out, adulter in castles, slighted, exchequer stabilised, coinage kept clean, Ars revived, sheriffs rotated. The papacy, Honorius III and then Gregory IX, prefers a quiet England sending Peter's pence to one that invites Capetian devotions. The political class relearns to bargain in hall, not hedge in ditch. The words from Runnymede turn from ceasefire terms into checklists. Judges can quote, sheriffs can fear, and town charters can echo. When Henry III comes of age, he will paint saints and import masons, and his long reign will prove that charters need teeth and treasures. His son will put the teeth back in, but the pattern is set. England has discovered that a realm can survive a bad king by writing his successors into corners, and that writing only matters if you can put men with swords behind the sentences when needed, and clerks with knives made of Latin behind them when the swords are sheathed. A long reign is a stress test. Henry III gets 56 years long enough to build a saint's church, bankrupt his friends, provoke a revolution, and accidentally midwife parliament. He begins as a child king with a war in his foyer, and ends as an old man passing a solvent, governable realm to a son who knows how to use it. The minority, 121-27, adult supervision as policy. William Marshall runs the opening act like logistics with a halo. He reissues Magna Carta, 1216, trims the Baron Enforcement Clause, beats the rebels at Lincoln, and wrecks Lewis's fleet at Sandwich. He pairs the Great Charter with the Forest Charter, because nothing buys peace like shrinking royal hunting law back to sanity. After Marshall dies, Hubert de Burgh picks up the wrench. Foreign garrisons out, adulterine castles slighted, sheriffs rotated, exchequer put back in harness. By the time Henry declares himself of age, the machine works and knows it works. That is both blessing and temptation. Personal rule phase 1. 127, 11232. The crown learns to spend. Henry loves pageantry and piety. That combination is not a sin, it's a budget line. He starts the Gothic rebuild of Westminster Abbey, a stone manifesto that says kingship is sacral, English, and expensive. He leans into alliances by marriage. Eleanor of Provence arrives in 1236 with a Savoyard affinity, capable uncles and cousins who speak French and spreadsheets. The Savoyards are managers, not raiders. They can build wardships into revenue and lawsuits into policy. The baronage grumbles, but grudgingly concedes that these import clerks keep the pipes flowing. Enter the Poitevins. In the 1240s, Henry first brought a second faction, the Lusinian half-brothers from Poitou, the Queen Mother's kin, men with swords, appetites, and a talent for extracting favours that look like insults in English. Between Savoyard accountants and Poitevin predators, the political market is cornered. Patronage centralizes at Westminster like incense at the high altar. Results: sheriffs bought and sold, castellanies handed to men who write thank you notes in French. Lawsuits decided the way gifts point. The charter is not dead, it's ignored on weekdays. Continental policy as debt machine. Henry cannot forget the ghost of Angevin Empire. Gascony is left, and he clings to it like a memory that costs cash every quarter. Campaigns in the 1240s-50s bleed money and deliver stalemates you can call honourable terms if you own the chronicler. Worse, he buys the Pope's Sicilian daydream. Edmund, Henry's second son, is promised a crown in southern Italy if England will fund the papal war against the Hohenstaufen. It is geopolitical cosplay with a papal credit card and the realm as guarantor. Subsidies for Sicily are levied like a tithe with teeth. The clergy are squeezed, the laity groans, and the barons develop a new hobby, reading tallies as manifestos. The procedural revolution bubbles. Not everything is graft and groaning. The courts keep humming. Royal ires resume. The exchequer's muscle memory strengthens. Shire administration produces a class of men, knights of the shire, who speak both plough and parchment. When the crown needs consent money, it learns to summon not just magnates by name, but also shires by quota. In 2054, knights are called to Westminster to grant a tax. Representation acquires a habit. No one writes a theory about commons yet. Practice writes it for them. Crisis as course correction. 12058, 11267. Provisions, civil war, and a new idea of consent. The revolt is not one spark, but a pile of damp hay that finally takes. In 1258, the baronage, led by a coalition that includes Richard de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, and soon enough Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, and the realm's most dangerous convert to English constitutionalism, corners the king at Westminster. The provisions of Oxford are the remedy: a council of 15 to supervise government, thrice yearly parliaments, sheriffs chosen locally, accounts audited, Lusinians shown the door. It is Magna Carta, upgraded from rights against the king to processes around him. Henry swears, wriggles, and seeks external absolution. The Pope Alexander IV, then Urban IV, obligingly annuls. The reformers double down with the provisions of Westminster 1259. Real estate law tuned to protect tenants from lordly games, abuses in local courts clip. Meanwhile, the Sicilian fiasco continues to eat coin and credibility. The country chooses a language it understands, control the purse. By 1261, papal bulls in hand, Henry tries to cancel the provisions. The realm answers with musters. The quarrel stalls and then reignites. Edward, the king's son, plays both scout and saboteur, sometimes the reformers' earnest interlocutor, sometimes the crown's steel. The arbitration trick of medieval Europe, Ask the French King, produces the Mise of Amiens, January 1264. Louis Knights Holy, and Frank calls the provisions void. The baronage hears, pick up your spears. Louis' May 1264 decides phase 1. Edward's rash pursuit of the London militia leaves the royal infantry exposed. Montfort wins the ridge and the day. The king is captured. Prince Edward is hostage. For a year, England is a workshop. Montfort governs by council, binds magnates to rules they hate. And here's the hinge: summons in January 1265 a parliament that, alongside bishops and barons, includes 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from selected towns. The precedent is not the invention of democracy, it is the discovery that taxation and legitimacy flow better when the classes who pay have people in the room. Montfort overreaches because reformers always do when they must govern and campaign at the same time. He alienates marcher lords, he centralizes too hard, he trusts oaths in a world that caches hostages. Edward escapes, manoeuvres, and Evesham, August 1265, becomes a slaughter-master's chivalry. Montfort dies, hacked beneath a storm. His cause bleeds into legend. The king returns, but the toothpaste isn't going back in the tube. Settlement, without forgetting. The savagery that follows, disinheritance of rebels and a royal land grab, nearly makes a second war. The dictum of Kenilworth, 1266, invents a way back. Rebels redeem their lands with fines scaled to stubbornness. It's restorative justice with ledgers. The Statute of Marlborough, 1267, locks in the parts of reform everyone can live with. No self-help distraint. Sheriffs curbed. Abuses of lords in local courts fenced. Parliamentary practice, summons of knights, consultation for extraordinary aids, survives not as theory, but as a way to get things done, without the country catching fire. Culture and cash, Henry's mixed legacy. On the debit side, Poitevin favourites, the Sicilian madness. Bursts of fiscal predation that handed his enemies a script. On the credit, 50 years of peace punctuated by limited war. A rebuilt Westminster that will define royal liturgy and memory. A political class house-trained to tick summons and to speak consent. Charters normalised as part of governance, not seditious graffiti. He raises Edward on crises that function as tutorials. How to break a revolt without breaking the realm. How to make statutes feel like cement rather than shackles. How to translate baronial sulk into national ordinance. When Henry dies in 1272, the realm does not convulse. Edward is abroad and nobody panics. Shires meet, sheriff account, justices ride, merchants haggle, and the crown waits on the road because the state can. That is the quietest praise a medieval king can earn. Edward comes home a tall verdict. He has learned war under Montfort, peace under his father's debts, and power in crusader camps, where logistics decide which saint wins. He will conquer where he must, legislate where he can, and drag the word realm from poetry into procedure. Start with money and law. 175 brings a package, Statute of Westminster, a miscellany that reads like a maintenance manual. It standardises writs, caps abuses by sheriffs and bailiffs, and reminds lords that due process beats cudgel, a new custom on wool. The great and ancient custom supplies dependable cash. In 1278, Statute of Gloucester announces a royal audit of franchises quo warranto. By what warrant do you hold this court, this toll, this gallows? Magnates rummage for charters. Justices treat silence as forfeiture. The message is institution, not insult. Liberties are the king's to grant, not a baron's to assume. Mortmain and mortgages. In 1279 De Religiosis, the Statute of Mortmain slows the slide of land into dead hands. Church corporations that never die and never pay reliefs. Its fiscal realism, in Latin, property should pass, pay and re-enter the market, of feudal dues. In 1285, Westminster II refines private law and drops 2 bombs that change English property forever. De Donis Conditionalibus locks entailed estates into a bloodline, Creditors weep, eldest sons smile, and quia emptores, 1290, stops subinfeudation. Tenants can sell, but the buyer holds of the same lord. Result, the pyramid stops growing new layers, jurisdiction freezes, free alienation expands sideways, not downward. In the same 1285 package, Statute of Winchester militarizes public order, watch and ward in towns, hue and cry in country, compulsory clearing of highways, so ambushes have nowhere to hide. It is policing by neighbourhood obligation, with royal teeth. Wales, conquer, colonize, codify. The march has always been a set of private wars with castles attached. The princes of Gwynedd turned that chaos into a principality. Edward will not share a frontier with a neighbour who acts like a king. Campaign 2077 is a squeeze blockade and encroachment, forcing Llywelyn ap Gruffydd into submission. Peace lasts a finger snap. Revolt 1282-83 is national, and Edward answers with total war bridges thrown, rivers commanded, winter campaigning that breaks assumptions. Llywelyn dies in a skirmish. Dafydd is captured and executed. Then comes the Statute of Rhuddlan 1284. English administration mapped onto conquered Wales, sheriffs, coroners, justices. Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, Beomeris, concentric stone answers to the question, how do you hold a mountain people? Rise with walled boroughs planted in their shadows. Colonists from England arrive with market privileges. The Welsh law of Hyoldada is trimmed to fit English frameworks, where convenient and left to operate locally elsewhere. In 1301, Edward invests his son as Prince of Wales, branding the conquest onto the royal family like a tattoo. Scotland overlordship becomes war. Succession creates the chance. Hubris supplies the plan. Alexander III's death, 2086, leaves a child, the Maid of Norway, as heir. When she dies, 1290, there are claimants, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the elder foremost. Guardians ask Edward to arbitrate. He accepts as overlord, a title no Scot had willingly acknowledged. The Great Cause, 1291-92, is a lawyer's carnival, ending with Balliol picked because his claim by primogeniture is cleaner. Edward immediately treats him like a sheriff with a crown. Scotland's political class revolts at the tone and the taxes. In 1296, Edward invades, sacks Berwick with a massacre that will become national memory, crushes the host at Dunbar, carts off the stone of Scone, and installs English rule by garrison. Balliol abdicates, tombed Hebard, the empty coat. Resistance reforms with William Wallace, 1297. Wallace wins Stirling Bridge by making English cavalry fight a causeway. Edward answers at Falkirk, 1298. Archers shatter the schiltrons. Cavalry and infantry split the rest. Wallace flees, is captured, and executed. The war does not end because occupation is a work order, not an oath. In 1306, Robert the Bruce kills his rival Comyn, seizes the crown, and begins the long game of raids, sieges, and hope. Edward dies in 1307. Armour packed, marching north to put an end to it. Jews, credit, and scapegoats. Edward knows the realm runs on credit and hates its creditors. In 1275, the Statute of the Jewry tries to drag Jewish money lending into licit channels and toward taxable commerce. It fails because Christians want loans and a villain, and the crown wants tollage now, not reform later. In 1290, after milking the community for generations and restricting them to ghettos and badges, Edward expels the Jews from England. The treasury pockets their movable wealth and claims their outstanding bonds. It's a moral failure and a fiscal stopgap. Italian bankers step in, and the realm learns a fresh dependency. The Church, jurisdiction and cash. Popes need coin, kings need consent. Boniface XIII's Claritis Licos, 12 to 196, tries to forbid clergy from paying lay taxes without papal leave. Edward slams the door on clerical legal protection, outlawry by fiscal pressure, until Archbishop Winchelsea blinks. A year later, cap in hand or chin up, the clergy pay. The bargain is not doctrinal, it's functional. The church stays rich and liturgical. The king stays funded and armed. Parliament from occasion to architecture. Henry III discovered that summoning shires and boroughs oils the gears. Edward makes it a norm. In 1295 he calls what later ages will label the model parliament bishops and abbots, earls and barons, 2 knights from each shire, 2 burgesses from each borough. The writ language is the signal. What touches all should be approved by all. This is not a house system yet, but the habit is there. Communities send men who can speak for them, and will be believed when they come home. Summons tie tax to council, and council to statute. Consents price confirmatial cartarum, 1227. War bills are high, Wales built in stone. Scotland garrisoned in mud, France looming as Gascony is never asleep. Edward pushes too hard, levies on wool, tolerages, forced service abroad, while he's away. The political class barons like Bohun and Bigod, cities that live on wool stage a strike in chainmail, the settlement. Confirmatial cartarum reaffirms Magna Carta and the Forest Charter. Promises that aids and tollages will not be levied without common assent, and concedes limits on purveyance, the Crown's habit of compulsory purchases at imaginary prices. In 1300 the articuli supercartas follow, proceduralizing grievance. If sheriffs or justices flout the charters, there's a forum and a remedy. The point is not poetry on parchment, it's that statute is now how the realm breathes. King proposes, estates consent, clerks engrave, justices apply. Administration, the invisible triumph. Beneath wars and parliaments, the bench becomes a profession. Yearbooks from the 1290s chatter with argument. Writs specialize. Itinerant justices run circuits like timetables. Counties are mapped by habit. The quo warranto inquests finalize who owns which jurisdiction. The Chancery records every promise anyone will ever try to forget. The Exchequer's books grow fat on tallies and on knowledge. Who owes, who pays, who lies. Forest law is trimmed by perambulations. Run 3001 that walk the boundaries and cut the green map back to honest scale. Boroughs proliferate with royal charters. Toll exemptions, market rights, courts of pie powder for merchants passing through. The state sells predictability and buys obedience with it. Why Wales falls and Scotland doesn't, yet. Wales is mountains stitched by limited polities. Kill the prince, wall the river mouths, seed boroughs, and the fiscal military machine can carry the rest. Scotland is a kingdom with a church, a legal culture, and elites who can agree to hate you. Edward's genius for grinding war meets a people with a memory of crowned and a geography that eats garrisons. The machine can conquer. Holding requires either consent or extinguishing the elite class. Edward picks coercion plus carpentry. It is almost enough. Audit the reign. On paper he is the perfect medieval executive. He makes law that outlives battles. He builds stone that outlives men. He wins wars that redraw maps. In practice, the very strengths of his system create counters. The statutes that regularize land also lock power into heirs who resist. The parliaments that authorize taxes also negotiate terms. The merchants who fund kings demand predictable rivers of wool and peace to float them. The church that pays tithes for Gascony will demand its immunities back tomorrow. He dies in 1307 on the road north. Bones aimed at a war that will make his son look small. But the verdict is already in. The Plantagenet state county courts, plus chancery writs, plus parliamentary consent, plus cash customs, is a machine now. Future kings will discover you can stall it, abuse it, even crash it into a ditch. You cannot wish it away. The realm has learned to govern by statutes, to pay by consent, to fight with contracts as often as with banners. The long 14th century will test every joint. Famine, plague, war, and a king who thinks charisma overrules arithmetic. The statutes will still be there when the banners roll. Edward I dies in armour on the northern road in 1307, pointing a kingdom like a spear at Scotland. His son Edward II inherits the spear and drops it on his foot. The 14th century will give England famine, pestilence, victories that look like destiny, and defeats that look like bills coming due. By the end of it, the country will speak more English in court, expect Parliament to price the Crown's ambitions, and live with a labour market that no lord can pretend is 1250 again. The medieval English state doesn't collapse under pressure, it mutates. A king who liked favourites more than fronts. Edward II's opening move is to recall Piers Gaveston, charming, insolent, a magnet for royal affection, and baronial rage. Magnates don't hate favourites, because they're foreign. Gaveston is Gascon, or fashionable. They hate favourites who spend royal credit and mock them in hall. The ordinances of 1311, a baronial attempt to put the monarchy under adult supervision, banish Gaveston, trim royal finance, and demand that the king take counsel. Edward breaks the paper leash, brings Gaveston back, and loses the room. The Earl of Warwick and others seize Gaveston. He is executed in 1312. The public lesson lands. Kings who ignore consent get discipline outside Parliament's minutes. Meanwhile, Scotland does not care about English melodrama. Robert Bruce, crowned in 1306 into a realm occupied and fined, fights like an insurgent who reads weather and cattle better than charters. Edward II marches north in 1314 with a large army. At Bannockburn, Bruce makes the ground choose the winner. Bog and burn break English cavalry, compact Scottish schiltrons turn charge into pile-up. The English infantry watches defeat as spectators. The English king flees. Scotland, de facto, is independent again. The border becomes an open sore. Raids, counter-raids, and a memory London can't edit. Before pestilence, hunger. The Great Famine, 1315, 1317, is weather turned into policy by necessity. Cold springs, relentless rain, rotting grain, seed corn eaten, draft animals slaughtered, prices spiking beyond what coin in a peasant's world can mean. Urban poor, riot, villages thin. Even magnates tighten belts. Government can't conjure sun. It can order purveyors not to strip markets bare and punish forestallers who profit on scarcity. The famine burns holes in bodies and in assumptions about the inexhaustibility of manorial labour. When prosperity returns in the 1320s, it rests on thinner foundations. The dispensers and the price of stubbornness. Edward II finds new favourites. Hugh Despenser, the younger, and his father. Land hunger plus royal favour equals lawsuits that feel like robbery. The Despenser War, 3021-22, is a baronial rising dressed in local grievance. The king answers with unusual competence at Boroughbridge, 130-22, where pikes and archery break the rebels on a narrow crossing. He then rules by fear. Forfeitures fatten the dispensers. Judicial terror keeps critics quiet. The silence lasts until a queen stops whispering. Isabella and Mortimer, regime change as private life. Isabella, the French queen, is tired of public humiliation and private peril. Sent to France in 1325 to negotiate over Gascony, she chooses not to come home to Despenser's England. With Roger Mortimer, a marcher lord, escaped from the Tower, she makes a coalition across the Channel, disaffected exiles, mercenaries with bills, and the promise that a change in personnel will feel like a change in regime. Invasion 1326 is a short campaign and a long reckoning. The Despensers die nastily. Edward II is forced to abdicate in favour of his teen son, Edward III, January 1327. The deposed king dies in Berkeley Castle later that year. Contemporary rumour gifts the tale a gruesome detail. Good scholarship gifts it doubt. What matters constitutionally is that deposition now has a parliamentary preface. The realm can, under pressure, say no more, with a vote. A minority, then an adult. Isabella and Mortimer govern in the young king's name like a mirror image of what they overthrew. Favourites, cash grabs, foreign embarrassments. In 1330, at 18, Edward III ends the experiment with a coup at Nottingham. Mortimer is seized and executed. Isabella retires into comfortable eclipse. The king starts as he means to go on, with war plans in his pocket, and a working majority in Parliament, when he wants money to execute them. Why war with France? Because borders, wool, and a crown that looks available. Gascony is England's cash cupboard in France. Wine, customs, prestige. The French crown has never liked a powerful vassal in Aquitaine. Flanders needs English wool to feed its looms. England needs Flemish allies to annoy France. Then Capetian dynastic luck fails in 1328. No adult sons survive. The throne passes to Philip VI of Valois. Edward III, grandson of Philip IV, through his mother, toys with a claim. In 1337, he plays the highest card. He claims the French crown. It is law fiction weaponized. A lever to turn feudal spats into a national war. Parliament, presented with glory on parchment and plunder in prospect, pays. War as audit of systems. The early war is a transport problem solved by naval murder. In 1340, at Sluys, the English fleet, archers on cogs, shatters the French at anchor. Result for a generation, the Channel is an English road. On land, the king fights like a man who studied Henry II's account books and the longbow's geometry. Cressy, 1346, is not a miracle, it is a syllabus. Men at arms dismount, archers in stakes, terrain exploited, cavalry charges turned into arrow harvest. The French chivalry obeys courage at the expense of arithmetic. The next year, Calais falls after an 11-month siege, and Edward does something cleverer than a victory parade. He plants a staple by making Calais the official market for English wool exports. He turns a conquest into customs. War begins to fund itself. Then the Black Death walks off the ship. In 1348-49, bubonic plague burns across the south, and then north, kills between a third and half of the people in a year, and teaches every institution what unprecedented feels like. Clergy die in service. Juries cannot be summoned. Harvests rot for lack of hands. Rents go unpaid because there is no one left to owe them. The state's response is not prayer, though there is plenty of that, but policy. The Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 1351, try to fix wages at pre-plague levels and criminalise excessive movement and bargaining. It is an attempt to legislate away supply and demand. It works on paper sometimes. In life, employers bid up wages quietly, labourers walk when they can, and lords adjust manorial books to reality, or go broke, insisting the 14th century is a rumour. The plague does cultural work law can't reach. Status softens. Bondman villains are still unfree in law, but with leverage in practice. Commutation of labour services for cash spreads. Fines for flight become revenue more than restraint. The yeoman starts to exist as a man with a few acres, some coin and a bow. Parliament will pass sumptuary laws 3063 to police dress and diet by rank. A tell that anxiety about blurred lines is real. War's second act, capture a king, break a budget. Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, fights with terrifying efficiency. In 1356, at Poitiers, he defeats and captures John II of France with a smaller force, using terrain, archery, and a feigned withdrawal that collapses the French advance into parcels. France loses not just a battle, but a king and a treasury. The Treaty of Bretigny, 1360, cashes the moment. Edward renounces his claim to the French crown in exchange for sovereignty, not just feudal lordship over an enlarged Aquitaine and a fat ransom for John. It looks like a win. It reads like a balloon payment, with an adjustable rate. The bill arrives in geopolitics. Charles V of France and his constable Bertrand du Guesclin do not play Crécy's game. They avoid open battle, grind garrisons, retake towns, and pay Rotier's mercenary bands to ruin English-held countryside when English pay falters. The English crown, stuffed on Bretigny promises, starts to default famously on Italian bankers in 1345 already, and on many contractors thereafter. The Black Prince, sick and stubborn, taxes Aquitaine hard to fund a Spanish adventure. The province responds by appealing fatally to the French king as overlord, letting legal theory back into a settlement designed to exclude it. By the 1370s, the map shrinks for England. Calais stays, much of Gascony holds. The sense of inevitable expansion dies. Edward III's last years feel like an empire coasting on old victories and new loans. Parliament grows a spine because math says it must. The 14th century's real revolution is procedural. Commons and lords now meet as distinct bodies. Wool customs, the maltoled and lay subsidies require consent, and consent becomes conditional. In 1341, the Commons assert that ministers should be sworn in Parliament, an early shot across the administrative bow. The habit doesn't stick yet. The attitude does. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading requires that court pleadings be in English, records remain in Latin. Law begins to speak the language of jurors and litigants. Governance sound changes. Then, in 1376, the good Parliament does something new: impeachment. The Commons accuse royal officers, most notably William Latimer, the Chamberlain, of corruption before the Lords, who try and condemn. The political motive is obvious. John of Gaunt, the king's son, has enemies. Everyone is broke and angry. The constitutional effect is permanent. The idea that ministers answer to Parliament as well as to the king has found its first hammer. The good Parliament's acts are rolled back next year by a counter-parliament packed and primed, but the tool remains on the bench. It will be used again. Religion gets a dissident vocabulary. John Wycliffe, an Oxford master with a genius for using theology as a prybar, argues that lordship is conditioned by righteousness. Corrupt clergy forfeit spiritual authority. Scripture should be accessible in the vernacular. Wealth has duties that, unmet, can be lawfully redirected. The word lollard becomes a label for heterodox lay piety and social criticism. The crown sometimes flirts. Wycliffe's anti-clerical economy suits a short treasury, sometimes flinches. Heresy is dynamite under order. What matters in this century is not yet persecution. It is that English becomes a language of serious religious debate. When people can argue doctrine in the tongue they use to buy fish, politics changes. The peasants' revolt, a labour market, picks up a mace. 3 decades after the first pestilence, The state tries to collect a third poll tax, 1380, to fund a France policy no one believes in, and to keep fleets at sea without admitting there's no money left. Collection is brutal in practice. Evasion is a skill, the insult is general. In June 1381, Essex and Kent erupt. Wat Tyler leads John Ball, a priest with sermons that slice. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, gives the rising a theology. London opens its gates because angry apprentices like bonfires. The targets tell you the programme, lawyers, because bonds and rolls bind men more than chains. Royal officials because purveyance, courts and taxes. Foreign traders because envy and anxiety. The rebels kill the Chancellor, Sudbury, and the Treasurer, Hales, ransack the Savoy, John of Gaunt's palace, and hunt records, destroying debt as if parchment is a manacle you can burn. Richard II, 14, rides into the fire at Mile End and offers what kings offer in extremis: charters, freedom for serfs, fixed rents, general pardon. Tyler presses harder at Smithfield. A scuffle. The Lord Mayor strikes. Tyler falls. Richard steps forward and performs the sovereign's oldest trick, embodying calm. I am your captain now, in effect. While loyal contingents reassert force, the revolt collapses as fast as it rose in the southeast. Echoes in the Midlands and East Anglia take longer to quiet. Then the charters are revoked wholesale. The law rolls back promises because constitutions are not written at sword point in a field. But the labour market remembers. Over the next century, serfdom decays from practice even when preserved in parchment. Lords prefer rent to litigation. Peasants with options use them. The cash economy finishes what pestilence started. Richard's majority, politics as personality test. The young king keeps the taste for theatre and the memory of 1381's fright. He also inherits a council dominated by John of Gaunt and other heavy magnates. In 1386-88, the wonderful Parliament and then the merciless Parliament attack the king's favourites, de la Pole, de Vere, using a peal of treason and then slaughter to reset the board. A group of nobles, the Lords Appellant, rule through Parliament's knives. Richard survives, broods, and in the 1390s consolidates a personal monarchy funded by clever use of customs and a circle of household men. He cultivates majesty, choreography, badges, justice as spectacle, and punishes those who humiliated him a decade prior. It works until it doesn't, which is how personal regimes always end. The century's constitutional ledger. Start with money. The Crown cannot pretend that extraordinary revenue exists without Commons' consent. In return for taxes, Commons ask for grievance redress and statute. This quid pro quo becomes a pattern. Vote wool customs, get the charters confirmed. Vote allay subsidy, get a statute clarifying labour law. By 1399, everyone in the political class understands the bargain of supply for remedies. Kings still threaten to rule without Parliament. Parliament still threaten to deny supply. Both sides still blink, because the alternative is either insolvency or rebellion. Move to language and law. The state that ran in Anglo-Norman and Latin now pleads in English while recording in Latin. Juries are more local. Commissions of Oyer and Termina handle disorder. Justices of the peace from the 1360s turn local gentry into royal police and petty judges. The Statute of Treasons, 1352, draws a tighter circle around the Crown's safety, with definitions that lawyers can quote. It is both shield and cudgel. The economy doesn't return to 3047. Wages are higher in real terms for many workers. Landlords lease out dimmers because hiring day labour is cheaper than feeding manorial households. Guilds in towns write rules that read like constitutions for crafts. The Calais staple diverts wool profits through royal toll gates. The company of the staple becomes an interest group. Parliament listens to the cloth industry expands inland, slowly eroding the raw wool export model. Society adds a middle that can read and sue. War taught the state contracts. Edward III's machine is not feudal musters, it is indenture war. Contracts with captains for specified numbers of men, for specified months, at specified pay, with captains then subcontracting down. The longbow is lethal. The ledger makes it march. This habit, government by contract, recorded and enforceable, seeps into peacetime governance. When commons ask for appropriation, taxes dedicated to purposes, they are thinking like captains who want guarantees. Why victory didn't stick? Because France learned. Because plague wrecked manpower and tax bases. Because English finance relied on Italian bankers who had their own wars and on parliamentary patience that wasn't infinite. Because chevauchés mounted raids that burn and terrify, create negotiating leverage, not stable provinces. Because every English gain required an occupation that cost more each year in garrisons than it yielded in customs, and because the enemy had time and a crown not subject to bargaining with commons. Close the century with a hinge. In 1399, while Richard II is in Ireland asserting overlordship in a way his great-grandfather would have applauded, Henry of Bolingbroke, banished cousin, son of John of Gaunt, lands in Yorkshire, ostensibly to recover his Lancastrian estates. The political nation, tired of Richard's royal theatre and punitive memory, chooses the simpler show, a competent magnate with cash and claims. Richard returns, is captured, and like Edward II, deposed with parliamentary ceremony. The commons and lords are now accustomed to writing reasons for a revolution. Lancastrian kingship begins with a vote, and a precedent, that the realm can change its king without changing its laws. What the 14th century actually did, it did not invent Parliament. It made commons indispensable. It did not abolish lordship. It changed the price of labour and the manners of power. It did not finish the war. It wrote the manual for waging it with contracts, customs and credit. It did not make English the language of all law. It made it the language of pleading and preaching, which matters more to how people experience justice and God. It did not free the peasantry in a day. It made serfdom uneconomic and apology necessary. It did not cure the crown of favourites. It taught the political class how to remove them with instrument and statute instead of only steel. When the century opens, England is a military franchise with statutes. When it closes, it is a parliamentary monarchy with a war habit, a labour market that won't be bullied back into villanage, and a political elite that can imagine legality even while they knife a king. The pestilence will come again. The French war will return meaner. The 15th century will burn its way to a new dynasty. But the operating system is set. Consent buys supply, statute buys obedience, English buys legitimacy, and ledgers, not genealogies, decide which plans survive first contact with reality.